Long before most people ever think to ask, Mary's full story has remained largely untold. The nativity scene captures only a fraction of who she was. Beyond the stable, beyond the manger, beyond that single sacred night, lies the complete journey of a woman who witnessed the impossible, endured heartbreak beyond measure, and carried a faith so powerful it altered the course of human history. From the ancient prophecies that spoke of her arrival, to her mysterious early years, to the terrifying escape into Egypt, to the moment she stood at the foot of a cross and watched her own child die, Mary's complete story reads like the most breathtaking and sorrowful epic ever recorded. Tonight, we are pulling together every fragment of her remarkable life, drawing from scripture, from historical records, and from ancient traditions, to present the full and faithful portrait of the Sacred Mother of the Messiah. But before we go any further, if you are new to this channel, please consider hitting that like and subscribe button if you have not done so already. Your support is what makes it possible for us to keep creating meaningful content that helps you learn something new or simply gives you a place to breathe and reflect. Also, let us know where in the world you are watching from and what time it is wherever you are. We genuinely love hearing from you. So, with no more delay, let us begin. Long before Mary ever took her first breath, the world sat quietly in shadow. Ancient Judea pressed beneath the firm grip of Rome, its people scattered and worn like seeds cast across hard, unyielding ground. The once proud kingdom of David had become little more than a distant memory, its glory fading the way evening light slowly drains from the sky. Roman soldiers walked the dusty stone streets of Jerusalem, their sandals striking against pathways where prophets had once stood and spoken of better days to come. Tax collectors sat behind their tables, counting coins that moved steadily out of Jewish hands and into Roman storehouses. The temple still rose, magnificent and gold-bathed above the city, but even its sacred walls could not hold out the crushing weight of foreign rule. In that season of darkness, hope flickered like a single candle struggling against the wind. Mothers leaned close to their children at night and whispered old, familiar stories of a coming king, a promised one who would set things right. They spoke of Isaiah's ancient words, of a virgin who would bring forth a son. These tales traveled from lip to ear and generation to generation, carefully passed along like precious heirlooms kept safe inside ordinary clay jars. The religious leaders carried heavy burdens of their own. Some, like the Pharisees, poured their energy into keeping the faith untouched through careful rules and long-held tradition. Others, like the Sadducees, had found ways to make a kind of peace with Roman authority. But all of them waited for something they could barely put into words. The very air seemed thick and heavy with expectation. Common people felt that weight most acutely. Farmers bent under Roman taxation. Fishermen worked their nets, while foreign vessels sailed waters that had once been their own. Craftsmen shaped wood and stone with tired hands, quietly wondering whether their children would ever taste true freedom. Yet even in their daily labor, something stirred beneath the surface, a quiet and certain knowing that change was on its way. Synagogues filled each Sabbath with voices rising in ancient song. The words of the Psalms climbed like incense smoke, lifting prayers and longings heavenward. Children traced Hebrew letters with small fingers, learning prophecies by heart. Each word carried within it the seed of a promise not yet fulfilled. The marketplace hummed with rumors. Some spoke of rebels hiding in the rocky hills. Others whispered of holy men who claimed to hear the voice of God directly. False messiahs appeared and disappeared like summer storms, leaving only disappointment behind them. But the true hope lived somewhere deeper, quietly burning in the hearts of those who had learned the sacred discipline of waiting. Women drew water from wells their grandmothers had drawn from before them. They sang as they worked, their melodies carrying the memory of miracles down through the years. Their songs told of Sarah's laughter, of Hannah's answered prayers, of Esther's breathtaking courage. They understood something profound. God had a long and consistent pattern of working through the unexpected, through the small and the humble. In the temple courts, priests performed their sacrifices according to the ancient law. The smoke climbed daily, carrying the intentions of a people who refused to let go of their faith. The ritual washings, the careful observances, the reading of sacred scrolls kept the flame alive, even through the longest and coldest nights. Young girls grew up hearing stories of heroines. They learned of Miriam, who led the women in celebration after the crossing of the Red Sea. They heard of Deborah, who governed Israel with both wisdom and strength. These stories planted seeds in tender soil, preparing hearts for something the world had never yet seen. The Romans built their roads and their aqueducts, their theaters and their bathhouses. They brought their gods and their customs, their language and their legal codes, but they could not build their way into Jewish hearts. There, in those secret interior places, another kingdom waited quietly to be born. Shepherds kept watch over their flocks on the hillsides surrounding Bethlehem. They knew these fields held deep memory. Ruth had walked here behind the harvesters. David had tended his father's sheep on these very slopes. The land itself seemed to breathe with promises not yet delivered. Each sunrise brought the world one day closer to the moment when heaven would reach down and touch the earth. In small villages scattered across Galilee and Judea, families gathered for the evening meal. They broke bread together and shared the simple food of ordinary people. Oil lamps cast warm, flickering light over weathered faces as fathers told their children again about the God who had never forgotten his people. Those quiet moments carried more power within them than all the armies Rome could assemble. The world was ready, even though it did not know it. Like a woman heavy with child, creation itself seemed to groan and wait with barely contained anticipation. The stage had been arranged, the players positioned. All that remained was for the curtain to rise on the greatest story ever told. In that ancient world of dust and stone, of hope and heartache, a young girl would soon be born. Her name would be Mary, and through her, everything would change. But for now, the world simply continued breathing in and out with the rhythm of ordinary days, completely unaware that the extraordinary was already approaching. The darkness was deepest in those last hours before the dawn. And in a small home in Nazareth, that dawn was drawing steadily, silently closer. The lineage of Mary. Mary's story does not truly begin with her birth. It begins much further back, with the long and luminous line of souls who came before her. Like a golden thread woven carefully through the vast fabric of time, her ancestry stretched across generations of faith and struggle, triumph and loss, grief and unexpected grace. The Gospel of Matthew traces a genealogy through Joseph, Mary's betrothed. Though she would conceive through divine miracle rather than human union, this lineage still carried weight. In Jewish culture, a husband's bloodline determined the child's place in the world. Through Joseph, Jesus would claim descent from King David, fulfilling the ancient prophecies that spoke of the Messiah's royal heritage. But Mary carried her own bloodline as well, her own sacred thread binding her to the promises of centuries past. Though the Gospels remain quiet on the subject of her parents, tradition has long spoken of Joachim and Anne, devout and faithful people who prayed earnestly for a child and received far more than they had imagined possible. The women who came before Mary shine through the pages of Scripture like stars scattered across a night sky. Tamar, who summoned courage when justice failed her. Rahab, whose faith in a God she barely knew saved her entire family. Ruth, whose loyalty wrote a legacy that outlasted generations. Bathsheba, who found redemption and honor after enduring tragedy and loss. Each name is its own story of survival, of grace, of God working through flawed and ordinary lives. These ancestral mothers had each faced their own impossible moments. Tamar disguised herself to claim what was rightfully hers when the system refused to deliver justice. Rahab hid foreign spies because something deep in her had come to believe in their God. Ruth left behind everything she had ever known to follow her mother-in-law into a future that offered no guarantees. Bathsheba endured scandal and sorrow before finding her place woven into the royal line itself. Their stories collectively prepared the way for Mary's own impossible moment. They demonstrated again and again that God works through the unexpected, the broken, and the willing. The lineage flowing toward Mary was not a polished or perfect record, it was real. It carried the full, unfiltered weight of human experience, all its joy and all its sorrow. In the quiet hills of Galilee, families passed down more than names and dates. They shared the actual lived breath of their ancestors' experiences. Children learned not just who their great-grandparents were, but how they had lived, what they had believed, and how they had faced their darkest hours. Mary's family tree grew in soil watered by tears and tended faithfully by prayers. Her ancestors had known slavery in Egypt and freedom in the Promised Land. They had witnessed the glory of Solomon's temple and mourned its destruction. They had survived exile in foreign lands and celebrated the joy of return. Each generation contributed its own chapter to the ongoing story of God's faithfulness. The royal line of David ran like a river through this ancestry. David himself, the shepherd boy who became king, the warrior poet who composed songs of praise and lamentation, whose heart for God burned so bright that centuries later people still held him as the standard for godly leadership. The promise made to David that his throne would endure beyond all earthly thrones lived quietly in every descendant's heart. Solomon followed, bringing wisdom and peace to Israel. His reign marked the height of the kingdom's earthly splendor. Yet even Solomon's story carried within it a cautionary note that earthly success and accumulated treasure can quietly pull a heart away from its true and sacred source. The line pressed on through times of division and conquest. Kings rose and fell. Some, like Hezekiah and Josiah, turned the people's hearts back to God. Others led them deeper into spiritual ruin. Through it all, the promise held. God's faithfulness consistently proved stronger than human weakness. When the kingdom fell and the people were carried into exile, the royal line appeared to be broken. Yet God's promises do not depend on earthly thrones or political power. In Babylon, beside rivers that were not their own, the descendants of David kept the faith breathing. They sang songs of Zion. They taught their children to remember. The line survived in their hearts when it could no longer survive on any throne. The return from exile brought a fresh surge of hope. Though they ruled no kingdom and wore no crowns, the descendants of David carried their identity like a hidden flame. Within their ordinary existence burned the genetic memory of greatness, the spiritual inheritance of divine promise. Each generation brought the world one step closer to what had been promised so long ago. Mary's more immediate ancestors lived quiet, humble lives in the hill country of Galilee. They were not wealthy or powerful by any worldly measure. Yet they carried within their ordinary days the extraordinary weight of divine purpose. They were links in a chain, stretching from Abraham forward into eternity itself. The blood flowing through Mary's veins held the faith of Sarah, who laughed at an impossible promise and then pressed her own child to her chest. It held the courage of Esther, who placed her life on the line for an entire people. It pulsed with the faithfulness of Ruth, who chose love and loyalty over safety and comfort. This lineage was about far more than bloodlines. It was about soul lines. The spiritual inheritance passed down through Mary's family was worth more than any earthly fortune. Stories of miracles witnessed and prayers answered, of faith tested and faith rewarded. Each generation added its own testimony to the rising chorus of God's goodness. When Mary opened her eyes for the very first time, she carried within her the accumulated prayers of centuries. Her ancestors' hopes lived in her heartbeat. Their faith moved through her blood. She was not merely a young girl in a small northern town. She was the living culmination of 1,000 promises, the walking fulfillment of 1,000 prayers breathed across 1,000 years. The lineage that had been building toward Mary was preparation for miracle. Every generation, every story, every moment of triumph, and every valley of suffering had been moving toward this single point in time, when a young woman would open her mouth and say yes to the impossible and change everything forever. The betrothal to Joseph. In the gentle rolling hills of Nazareth, where olive trees cast their long shadows across dusty paths baked warm by the sun, a young woman named Mary was about to take her first step toward a destiny she could not yet imagine. The customs of her people were about to bind her life to a carpenter named Joseph, setting in motion a sequence of events that would reshape the entire world. Betrothal in Mary's time was something far more substantial than what modern people call engagement. It was a sacred and legally binding contract, nearly as weighty as marriage itself. Families negotiated these arrangements with careful deliberation, considering not only affection, but lineage, character, and depth of faith. A girl's entire future depended on the wisdom of this single choice, and thoughtful parents took that responsibility with the utmost seriousness. Mary likely had little direct say in the selection of Joseph as her future husband. This was not cruelty, but simply the way of her culture. Parents chose partners based on accumulated wisdom and long experience, understanding that the warmth of young love could fade while mutual respect and shared values built something that could actually last. They searched for a man who would provide steadily, protect faithfully, and honor God with consistency. Joseph came from David's royal line, though his hands were calloused from working with wood rather than softened by the wearing of any crown. In Nazareth, a carpenter was a respected and skilled craftsman, someone capable of building everything from the wooden yoke that fit across an ox's shoulders to the heavy beams that supported a family's roof. His work demanded precision, patience, and physical strength, qualities that spoke quietly and powerfully to his character. The Hebrew word for his trade, tekton, carried a meaning broader than simple woodworking. He was a builder, a man capable of working with stone and metal as readily as with timber. In a small community like Nazareth, those skills made him genuinely valuable. Homes needed regular repair, farming tools wore out and needed replacing, and furniture broke down with the steady use of daily life. Joseph's hands fed and sheltered the people around him. In a close-knit town, where everyone knew the details of everyone else's life, a man's character was essentially public record. Joseph was known as righteous, a word that carried enormous depth in Jewish culture. It described someone who lived genuinely according to God's law, who dealt honestly and fairly with those around him, and who could be trusted with precious and fragile things. The betrothal ceremony itself would have been simple, but weighted with meaning. Joseph's family would have approached Mary's family with a formal proposal, offering a bride price that reflected honor toward her and acknowledgement of her worth. This was not a transaction of purchase, but a gesture of deep respect. The amount spoken said something important about how the man valued the woman he hoped to marry. Mary's parents, Joachim and Anne, according to tradition, would have weighed the offer thoughtfully. They had watched Joseph for years, as had the whole community. They had seen the kind of man he was becoming. This match would bring their daughter security and honor, two gifts of immeasurable value in an uncertain world. When the two families reached agreement, the betrothal was made official through ceremony and formal contract. Joseph would place a ring on Mary's finger or offer her a coin, making before witnesses a public declaration of his commitment. From that moment, she was legally his, though they would not share a home or a life until after the wedding celebration, which typically came about a year later. That waiting period served important and practical purposes. It confirmed the bride's purity. If she were found to be pregnant, the child could not possibly be her husband's. It also provided time for real preparation. Mary would grow familiar with the particular rhythms and customs of Joseph's household, while he worked to complete their future home and gather the resources that would sustain their life together. Mary was probably somewhere between 12 and 15 years old at the time of her betrothal, the customary age range for Jewish girls in her era. By modern sensibilities, this seems young, but in a world where life was shorter and responsibilities arrived earlier, it was entirely normal. She would have spent her childhood learning from her mother the full range of skills that running a household required. Joseph was likely several years older, perhaps in his early 20s. He would have finished his training as a craftsman and reached the point where he could realistically support a family. The age difference was a practical matter. He needed time to establish himself before he could take on the weight of a wife and children. The months of betrothal passed quietly, filled with the ordinary work of preparation. Mary would have woven cloth and gathered her dowry, the household goods she would bring with her into marriage. Joseph would have built furniture for their home, perhaps a solid bed frame, sturdy storage chests, a smooth-topped table for their evening meals. Each piece crafted with the quiet hope of a future that felt both ordinary and beautiful. During this period, their contact was limited. Unmarried couples did not spend time alone together. Their interactions remained supervised and measured, yet they would have watched each other across the distance of community gatherings, Sabbath worship, and festival celebrations. Quiet glances and careful words began to lay the foundation of something real between them. What Mary felt during those months is something the Gospels never quite tell us. Did excitement about her approaching future mix with fear about leaving the home she had always known? Did hope rise when she thought of the man who would soon bear her through life? The Gospels hold her silence and let us sit with the wonder of what moved inside her. Joseph, too, remains largely quiet in the written record. We can imagine him at his workbench, drawing a plane steadily across a plank of wood, his thoughts drifting toward the girl who would soon share his name. Perhaps he felt the weight of what was being trusted to him. Perhaps he quietly resolved to be worthy of it. Their betrothal was celebrated and blessed by family and community. It was, by every outward measure, an ordinary event. Nazareth had witnessed many such unions, many young couples stepping into the ancient rhythm of marriage and family. No one present could have imagined that this particular betrothal would become the very hinge on which all of human history would turn. The customs that joined Mary and Joseph were ancient and time-tested. They gave structure to society and protection to the vulnerable. Yet those same customs were about to be stretched well past their breaking point by a miracle that no law, no tradition, and no human imagination could have prepared for. As Mary and Joseph moved through the quiet months of their engagement, heaven watched and waited with a patience that spanned eternity. The stage had been set. The players were in their places. And soon, an angel would arrive, carrying news that would transform their utterly ordinary betrothal into the first chapter of the most extraordinary story the world would ever know. The Annunciation, a world stopped in time. The morning began exactly like every morning before it in Nazareth. Mary woke to the familiar sounds of a town coming to life, roosters calling, merchants arranging their goods, children running through narrow streets. She could not have known that before that day came to a close, the entire trajectory of human history would turn on her response to a question no human being had ever been asked before. Luke's Gospel places the Annunciation in the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, a spring morning in the hill country of Galilee. Mary was most likely inside her family's home, perhaps working through the quiet tasks of the morning or spending a few unhurried moments in prayer. Jewish girls of her age and upbringing often carved out such pockets of stillness for reflection, particularly those raised in households where faith was a daily, living practice. The angel Gabriel appeared to her without any warning at all. One moment she was alone with her own thoughts. The next, she was in the presence of a being of pure light and divine authority. The sight must have been utterly overwhelming. Angels in Scripture rarely appeared in soft or soothing forms. They came carrying the full weight of heaven's authority, bearing messages that altered the course of everything. Gabriel's opening words reveal something significant about Mary's character and standing before God. "Greetings, you who are highly favored. The Lord is with you." The angel's greeting was not a generic salutation. It suggested that God had been watching Mary for some time, observing her heart, her habits of faith, and her readiness for something she could not yet envision. She was not selected at random, but chosen deliberately and purposefully for qualities that heaven itself had recognized and valued. Mary's response shows a depth of wisdom that exceeded her years. The text says she was greatly troubled by the greeting and paused to think carefully about what it might mean. She did not dismiss what was happening or assume her own imagination was playing tricks on her. She stayed present. She listened. She engaged with the mystery rather than retreating from it. Her thoughtful reaction revealed a mind capable of sitting with uncertainty rather than fleeing from it. The angel pressed forward with words that would echo across all of human history. "Do not be afraid, Mary. You have found favor with God. You will conceive and give birth to a son, and you are to call him Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High." Every phrase that followed carried implications of staggering proportions. This child would be unlike any child before or after him. He would inherit the throne of David. His kingdom would have no end. Mary was being invited and asked to become the mother of the long-awaited Messiah, the one her people had held on to through centuries of waiting and disappointment. Mary's question in response was both practical and profound. "How will this be?" she asked. "Since I am a virgin." She was not calling God's power into question. She was genuinely seeking to understand his method. Her betrothal to Joseph was months away from any physical union. The biological impossibility of what she was being told was not lost on her for even a single moment. Gabriel's answer introduced a concept that would stand at the very center of Christian belief from that day forward. The Holy Spirit would come upon her. The power of the Most High would overshadow her. The child born from this divine action would be called the Son of God. Conception here would not come through any human means, but through the direct and creative act of God himself. To offer Mary something tangible alongside this announcement, the angel pointed to Elizabeth. Her elderly cousin, a woman long past the natural age of childbearing, was already 6 months pregnant. "Nothing is impossible with God," Gabriel declared, giving Mary living, breathing, walking proof that the supernatural was already actively at work within her own extended family. Mary stood at the edge of the most consequential decision in the history of the world. She could have asked for more time. She could have demanded further proof or a more detailed explanation. She could have simply said no. Instead, she offered the words that made everything possible. "I am the Lord's servant. May your word to me be fulfilled." Her acceptance was complete, immediate, and unconditional. She did not yet know how she would explain any of this to Joseph. She did not know what her parents would say. She could not fully see what her community's reaction would be. She could not trace the path forward into any kind of clarity. She simply said yes to God's plan, entrusting herself entirely to his goodness, even while standing in the fog of the completely unknown. The moment of Mary's consent was the moment when eternity broke into time. The second person of the Trinity, who had existed before the beginning of all things, took on human flesh within Mary's womb. The infinite became finite. The eternal stepped inside of time. The Creator became the created. All of this rested on the willingness of one young woman to trust. The physical miracle was only a part of the wonder. Mary's body would now nourish the one who had created her. Her heartbeat would sustain the one who had spoken the stars into existence. She would teach language to the Word who had spoken the universe into being. The paradoxes were as breathtaking as they were mysterious, too large for any human mind to fully hold. After delivering his message, Gabriel departed. Mary was left alone with the greatest secret the world had ever held. The Word was becoming flesh within her, but she could speak of it to no one. The Messiah was coming, but she could not yet announce it. She carried the hope of the entire world in her womb and in the quiet interior of her heart. The silence that followed the angel's departure must have been unlike any silence she had ever known. Mary was the only human being alive who knew that the long-awaited salvation of the world was beginning. She held within her the secret of the incarnation, the staggering knowledge that God was making good on his promises in ways no human prophet had ever fully pictured. Her life had been ordinary until that very moment. Household tasks, learning from her mother, preparing for marriage. And now she carried within her body the answer to every prayer, the fulfillment of every prophecy, the hope of every generation that had ever lived. The weight of that calling was enough to buckle the strongest of souls. Yet Mary's response showed she was equal to it. Her immediate acceptance revealed a heart that had long been surrendered to God's purposes. She had been prepared for this moment, not through extraordinary education or supernatural preparation, but through a lifetime of simple, steady faith and quiet, daily trust. The Annunciation was complete, but its effects would travel through centuries. Mary's yes would echo forward through all of time, making possible the redemption of everything that had been lost. In saying yes to God, she said yes to joy and to sorrow, to wonder and to pain, to the highest honor any human being had ever been offered, and to the deepest grief any mother has ever been asked to carry. She said yes to becoming the mother of the Savior of the world. As Gabriel's light faded and ordinary morning light returned to the room around her, Mary was left to take in the full weight of what had just occurred. Her life had been transformed in a single conversation. She was no longer simply a young woman from Nazareth. She was the chosen vessel for the Word made flesh, the human doorway through which salvation would enter the world. Mary's inner turmoil and acceptance. In the quiet that settled after Gabriel's departure, Mary sat in a stillness unlike anything she had felt before. The angel's words continued to move through her mind, like ripples spreading across the surface of still water. Each time they returned, they brought fresh surges of both wonder and terror. She was completely alone with the most extraordinary secret in all of human history, and its weight pressed down heavily on her young and unprepared shoulders. The immediate questions came rushing in, urgent and sharp. How would she tell Joseph? What would her parents make of it? The law of Moses was not vague on the matter of unmarried women found to be pregnant. The potential consequences were severe and, in some interpretations, even deadly. Her community would not be positioned to understand divine conception. They would see what appeared in front of them: scandal, shame, and broken trust. Mary's mind moved quickly through one possible explanation after another, each one sounding more impossible than the last. Who would genuinely believe that an angel had appeared to her? Who would accept that the child beginning to grow within her had been conceived by the Holy Spirit? The truth itself was so far outside the boundaries of ordinary experience that speaking it aloud might sound to any listener like desperate invention. The social weight of it pressed heavily. In her small, tightly woven town, reputation was everything. Unmarried pregnancy brought shame not only to the woman herself, but to her entire family. Her father's honor would be wounded. Her mother would face the sting of whispered blame. The ripple effects would spread to touch everyone she loved. Joseph's reaction worried her more than anything else. He was a righteous man. He took God's law seriously. How could she ask him to believe something so completely outside the range of normal human experience? How could she expect him to take on the weight of marrying a woman pregnant with a child that was not his? Even if he somehow believed her account, what would that belief cost him in the community's estimation? Mary found herself caught between two competing fears: the fear of human judgment on one side and the fear of failing God on the other. Both directions seemed to lead through valleys of suffering. And yet, somewhere in the center of her confusion, a light began to form. It was the memory of Gabriel's words, "Nothing is impossible with God." She began to recall the stories her mother had told her through the years, the testimonies of other women who had been brought to the edge of the impossible and had found God faithful there. Sarah, who laughed when she heard the promise of a child in her old age and then held that very child, Isaac, against her chest. Hannah, who wept at the altar for years over an empty womb and then lifted her voice in pure, unreserved praise at Samuel's birth. God had a long and documented history of making the impossible breathingly real. The genealogies she had memorized as a girl began to glow with new meaning. The Messiah would come through David's line. And now, through her, that ancient and long-carried promise was beginning its final unfolding. She was not simply an unmarried girl in a difficult situation. She was a chosen instrument, placed deliberately in the hand of God's redemptive design. That realization arrived with both humility and a strange, unexpected strength. Her faith and her fear began to wrestle openly. She had been raised to believe in a God who kept every promise he had ever made. A God who consistently worked through ordinary people to accomplish things that were anything but ordinary. Her ancestors had arrived at their own impossible moments and had found God waiting faithfully on the other side. Could she trust the same God who had never once failed them? Prayer became her first and most necessary refuge. In those first hours, she poured herself out honestly before the God who had chosen her, asking for strength she did not yet possess, for a path she could not yet see. The child beginning to form within her was already a living bridge between heaven and earth, and she found herself drawing on a divine strength she had not known she carried. The thought of Elizabeth, mentioned specifically by Gabriel as a sign, offered its own kind of comfort. Her elderly cousin was already living inside her own miracle. Elizabeth would understand, in the way only another woman experiencing the impossible could understand, what Mary was walking through. The thought of sharing this burden with someone who had already seen God do what should not be possible brought the first real breath of relief she had felt since the angel left the room. As the hours moved forward, Mary's acceptance deepened and settled. She began to understand that the yes she had spoken to Gabriel was not the conclusion of anything. It was the beginning. Each day ahead would require its own fresh act of surrender, its own renewed decision to trust. The Annunciation was not only about conception, it was about a lifetime of choosing, again and again, to cooperate with a plan she would never be fully able to see. She thought about the child forming within her, the Son of the Most High, the promised Messiah, the one who would save his people from everything that had broken them. Her son would be the answer to centuries of accumulated longing, the fulfillment of words spoken by prophets who had died long before she was born, the hope the world had been carrying for longer than any living person could remember. The magnitude of that calling moved through her like a current too wide and deep to measure. Mary came to understand that when her suffering arrived, as she already sensed it would not be meaningless. Her pain would be woven into God's plan to address the pain of the entire world. Her willingness to be misunderstood would help carry understanding to all of humanity. That realization did not remove the fear, but it slowly began to give it a shape and a purpose. The young woman who had woken that morning thinking about wedding preparations and household tasks was no longer quite the same person. In her place stood the Theotokos, the God-bearer, the woman chosen to bring the eternal into human flesh. The change was not only physical, it was spiritual, as deep and irreversible as the miracle now taking place within her own body. The turmoil that had flooded her in those first hours gradually settled into something more solid than peace. It became a foundation of trust she had not known she was capable of building. She could not see clearly where the path led, but she could see the God who held it. Her circumstances were bewildering, but her calling was glorious. The road ahead might well be filled with pain, but she knew where it ended. The unanswered questions that had felt so urgent earlier began to loosen their grip. The God who had accomplished the miracle of conception could surely manage the complications of explanation. The one who had chosen her for this task would provide whatever grace the task required. That settled knowing became her resting place. In the growing quiet of evening, Mary found her rhythm again. Fear gave way to faith, confusion gave way to a deeper kind of clarity, turmoil gave way to trust. She was the Lord's servant, and his word would be fulfilled. Whatever lay ahead, whether joy or grief, honor or shame, understanding or rejection, she would walk it in the company of the God who had spoken her name. The girl who had said yes to the angel was learning, in real time, what it meant to keep saying yes to everything that first yes would require. Her acceptance was becoming not just a past moment of consent, but a continuous posture of the heart. A way of living that would carry her through the darkest valleys she could not yet see, and up toward the high places she could not yet imagine. Mary's journey from fear to faith became a pattern for every person who would later follow her son. In learning to trust God's goodness while standing inside impossible circumstances, she blazed a trail that others would walk for generations beyond counting. Her turmoil and her acceptance together became part of the gospel story, showing that even the chosen must actively choose, even the called must genuinely answer, even the blessed must decide to believe. The journey to Elizabeth. With the angel's words still moving through her like a current she could not quite settle, Mary made a decision that would bring the first real confirmation of the miracle growing within her. She would travel to the hill country of Judea to visit her cousin Elizabeth, the older woman who was living her own impossible pregnancy. The journey would take her away from the whispers and worried glances that were already beginning to form around her in Nazareth. The trip from Galilee down to the Judean hills was no simple afternoon excursion. For a young woman, possibly already carrying the earlier signs of pregnancy, it required careful planning and real courage. The distance was roughly 80 miles, a journey spanning several days through rugged and sometimes dangerous terrain. Mary likely joined a caravan of pilgrims or traveling merchants for the journey. Women did not travel alone in her time and world. These groups provided both safety and companionship along the dusty roads, connecting the scattered communities of Palestine. The slow pace of walking gave her long, uninterrupted hours to sit with the extraordinary change that had so completely reshaped her life. The road wound through valleys and climbed over hills, moving past silver-green olive groves and vineyard terraces carved carefully into the hillsides. Mary would have passed seasonal workers tending their fields, shepherds moving their flocks toward better pasture, and fellow travelers pursuing their own ordinary business. The world continued at its regular rhythm all around her, while she quietly carried the most extraordinary secret it had ever held. During those long hours of steady walking, Mary must have turned over in her mind again and again the question of how Elizabeth would receive her news. Would her older cousin believe the account of angelic visitation? Would she be able to understand the divine miracle unfolding in Mary's body? Gabriel had specifically mentioned Elizabeth's own miraculous pregnancy as a sign, as evidence of God's willingness and ability to do what seemed impossible. But would that make Elizabeth more prepared to receive Mary's own account, or would the strangeness of it still be too much? The anticipation grew stronger with each mile. Elizabeth and her husband Zechariah lived in a town in the hill country, traditionally identified as Ein Kerem, west of Jerusalem. Zechariah was a priest, which meant their household was one of deep faith and careful religious observance. Such a home might be more naturally open to recognizing God's supernatural work when it appeared at the door. When Mary finally arrived, tired from the road and likely nervous about the conversation waiting for her, she called out a simple greeting. What happened next would confirm everything Gabriel had told her and bring the encouragement she had been needing more deeply than she had realized. At the sound of Mary's voice, the baby inside Elizabeth's womb leaped. The movement was sudden and unmistakable. Elizabeth herself was immediately filled with the Holy Spirit and recognized, without any prior explanation from Mary, exactly what her young cousin's visit meant. She cried out in a voice full of joy, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the child you will bear." Those words must have struck Mary with the force of a wave breaking. Here was confirmation that what she had experienced was real. The miracle growing within her was recognized, not by a human being reasoning her way toward belief, but by the Holy Spirit speaking directly through Elizabeth, and even through the unborn child leaping in her womb. The baby who would become John the Baptist was already responding to the presence of his Lord, though both of them were still months away from breathing open air. Elizabeth continued speaking, wonder rising in her voice. "But why am I so favored that the mother of my Lord should come to me?" Guided entirely by the Holy Spirit, without any human explanation or prior knowledge, Elizabeth had recognized that Mary was carrying the Messiah himself. Centuries of prophecy were beginning their fulfillment, and Elizabeth could feel it arriving on her doorstep. The meeting between these two expectant mothers was a moment of pure and undiluted recognition. Elizabeth had already been living inside her own miracle for 6 months, experiencing firsthand the staggering wonder of pregnancy arriving in her old age. And now she found herself standing face to face with something even greater, the incarnation of God, taking shape in human flesh within her young cousin's body. Elizabeth's blessing deepened still further. Blessed is she who has believed that the Lord would fulfill his promises to her. These words went beyond simply celebrating the fact of Mary's pregnancy. They honored the faith and courage it had taken for Mary to say yes, to accept a calling so large and so unlikely that most people would have quietly looked for a way to decline. The validation Mary received in that moment was both profound and necessary. After days or weeks of holding her secret entirely alone, quietly wondering at times whether she had somehow misunderstood or imagined the angelic encounter, Mary now had divine confirmation delivered through another living person. The Holy Spirit, speaking through Elizabeth, provided the reassurance she needed to continue trusting God's plan with her whole heart. The two women came together in an embrace that carried more meaning than either could fully articulate. Elizabeth's pregnancy had prepared her to receive and understand even Mary's more extraordinary situation. Both women were experiencing God's power to create life in circumstances that defied all ordinary explanation. Elizabeth, beyond the natural age of having children. Mary, without the natural process of conception. In that recognition and blessing, two impossibilities embraced each other. In that moment, Mary's heart overflowed. The relief, the joy, the deep and rushing sense of God's goodness all rose together and spilled over into the magnificent prayer that has been known ever since as the Magnificat. Her soul magnified the Lord. Her spirit rejoiced in God, her Savior. The journey had brought her exactly to what she had needed most. Confirmation that God was at work in her life. Support from another woman who understood divine miracle from the inside. And the encouragement to keep trusting, even with the path ahead still largely obscured. The meeting between Mary and Elizabeth became a bridge stretched across a threshold of history. Elizabeth represented the culmination of all that God had been doing under the Old Covenant, the faithful wife of a temple priest, blessed at last with the child who would prepare the way for the Messiah. Mary represented the beginning of something the world had never yet seen. God himself arriving in human flesh, every promise ever made beginning its final fulfillment. Their time together strengthened both women for the particular challenges each would face. Elizabeth would return to her community carrying the astonishment of late-in-life pregnancy and the mystery of her husband's enforced silence. Mary would return to Nazareth, carrying not only her divine child, but also a new and steadier confidence that God was at work in her life in ways that surpassed all human understanding. The hill country of Judea had hosted the first meeting between the forerunner and the Messiah, between the voice that would cry in the wilderness and the word that had become flesh. Two mothers, two miracles, two pieces of one redemptive plan, recognizing each other with joy, Joseph's dilemma and the dream. Back in Nazareth, while Mary rested in the shelter of Elizabeth's blessing, Joseph was in the grip of the most painful dilemma he had ever faced. The woman he was pledged to marry had returned from Judea visibly pregnant, and Joseph knew with quiet, devastating certainty that the child was not his. The discovery did not arrive gently. It shattered his world and left him suspended between law and love, between justice and mercy, with no clear or painless way forward. Joseph's standing in the community rested on his reputation as a righteous man. He lived carefully according to God's law, and that careful, consistent living was the foundation of everything others believed about him. He was known as someone who could be trusted, whose word held, whose character did not waver. And now he faced a situation that threatened to collapse everything he had built, everything he believed about right and wrong, into a single, inescapable moment. The law of Moses was not ambiguous on this matter. The book of Deuteronomy prescribed death by stoning for unfaithful women who had been betrothed. By Joseph's time, Roman occupation had complicated the Jewish community's ability to carry out capital punishment directly, but the legal and social consequences that remained were still deeply severe. A woman found unfaithful could be publicly disgraced, formally divorced, and left without resources or recourse. Her family would absorb the shame alongside her. Joseph's heart was breaking quietly and completely. He had looked ahead to his life with Mary. He had prepared their home with his own hands. He had pictured their future taking shape through the years. She had been young and full of faith, from a family known for its virtue. The discovery of her pregnancy was not simply a legal problem, it was the dismantling of everything he had been looking forward to. The practical questions pressed in relentlessly. How had this happened? Who was the father? Had Mary been forced into this, or had she chosen it willingly? The girl he believed he knew seemed to have become someone entirely different. The trust that was supposed to be the very foundation of their life together had been damaged before their wedding had even taken place. And yet, something about Mary's demeanor stopped him. She did not carry herself the way a woman caught in a shameful act would carry herself. There was no visible guilt, no desperate pleading, no attempt to construct a convincing denial. She seemed to move through her days with a strange and unshakable peace, as if she possessed some knowledge that made sense of everything he could not understand. But what explanation could possibly exist that would justify this? His friends and family would have expected swift action. A righteous man could not appear to ignore such a clear violation of their betrothal agreement. His own reputation was directly at stake. If he seemed weak or willfully naive, the community's respect for him would erode quickly. Everyone around him was waiting to see what he would do. The option of public exposure was available to him. He could bring the matter before the proper authorities, present the evidence of Mary's condition, and allow the law to follow its prescribed course. This would protect his reputation and demonstrate that his commitment to righteousness was genuine. But something deep in Joseph pulled back hard from that option. He could not bring himself to expose Mary to public humiliation, regardless of what she appeared to have done. Perhaps it was love, still present beneath the wound. Perhaps it was wisdom that whispered there was more here than he yet understood. Or perhaps it was simply mercy, the kind that refuses to deliver the maximum judgment, even when it has the right to do so. Joseph settled on a different path. He would dissolve the betrothal quietly, using a private legal process that would end their arrangement without public display or spectacle. This would release him from obligation and spare Mary the worst of what public disgrace could deliver. It was a solution that honored his commitment to righteousness while extending a mercy he was not legally required to give. The decision brought no peace with it. His nights became contests against confusion and grief. He loved Mary, but felt he could not marry her. He wanted to act mercifully, but could not shake the weight of what the law required. He trusted his own judgment, but could make no sense of what he had seen and what he felt in the same breath. The internal conflict wore at him steadily, without rest, sleep, when it finally arrived, brought something unexpected. In a dream that carried the quality of something more real than waking life, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph with words that changed everything. The messenger addressed him directly. "Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife." The way the angel used son of David was not incidental. It was deliberate, a reminder of Joseph's royal lineage, his place in the line of the great king of Israel, and the messianic promises that had traveled through every generation of that line. The greeting was telling him quietly but clearly that his role in this unfolding story was larger than he had imagined. What followed was staggering in its simplicity and its magnitude. "What is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins." Mary had not been unfaithful. She had been chosen. The angel's words reordered every fact Joseph thought he understood. Mary's unexplained peace suddenly made complete sense. The child she carried was not the product of betrayal, but of divine action. She had not broken faith with Joseph, she had kept faith with God. The child growing within her was the long-awaited Messiah. Joseph's entire world pivoted in a single dream. His betrothed was not an adulteress. She was the most singularly blessed woman who had ever lived. The child was not evidence of broken trust. It was the fulfillment of every prophecy his ancestors had carried forward through generation after generation. His dilemma was not actually about justice versus mercy. It was about faith versus fear. And God was asking him to step into the greatest story ever told, not as a bystander, but as a participant. The angel's instruction was clear. Take Mary as his wife, protect her and the child she carried, name the boy Jesus. Joseph was being called to become the earthly father of the Son of God, to provide the covering, the protection, and the steady daily presence that the Savior of the world would need while he grew from infant to man. When Joseph woke from the dream, the confusion was gone. The pieces of a puzzle that had seemed deliberately unsolvable now fit together with a clarity that felt like light. Mary's pregnancy was not a scandal, it was a miracle. His role was not to judge, but to guard. His calling was not to understand everything before moving forward, but to obey faithfully with what he had been given. Joseph chose to trust what the angel had said over what his own human reasoning had constructed. He would take Mary as his wife. He would stand as father to the child within her. He would stand guard over the Holy Family with every ounce of the strength and steadiness God had built into him. The man who had quietly resolved to dissolve the betrothal, now prepared to embrace it fully and without reservation. Love and faith joined forces to move beyond law and convention. And Joseph, son of David, righteous craftsman, keeper of the sacred trust, became in that moment exactly the man the moment required. He would stand before the community's questions and hushed rumors with the quiet confidence of a man who knew he was walking in God's will. His righteousness would shine not through conforming to what people expected, but through his obedience to what heaven commanded. The carpenter who had spent his life shaping wood and stone now found himself chosen to shape the earliest days of the Word made flesh. His hands, the same hands that built furniture and crafted shelter, would build security around the Savior. The skills that had constructed homes for others would now shelter the one who was destined to become the world's true refuge. Joseph's dream was the moment he stepped into the same great adventure of faith that Mary had already entered. Both had received visits from angels. Both had been invited to believe something that defied all logic. Both had chosen trust when understanding fell short. Their partnership would prove absolutely essential for the protection and nurturing of the child who would alter the course of everything. The road to Bethlehem. As the months passed following Mary's return from Elizabeth's home, and as her pregnancy continued to grow more visible, life in Nazareth had found a new kind of rhythm. Joseph had taken her as his wife after his dream, and their quiet union had offered some measure of protection from the gossip circling around them. Even so, curious glances and whispered conversations followed them through the village, as neighbors counted months and quietly calculated the timing of things. Then came the imperial edict that would set the final act of the nativity story into motion. Caesar Augustus, seated in power in his Roman palace, had decided to conduct a census of every corner of his vast empire. Every person was required to return to the town of their ancestors to be registered for the purposes of taxation. The decree reached even the smallest villages of Galilee, where Roman authority pressed itself into every corner of daily existence. For Joseph, the census meant a journey south to Bethlehem, the city of David. As a descendant of that great king, his family records were held there, and Roman efficiency required precise registration at the proper location. Under ordinary circumstances, the roughly 80-mile journey would have been manageable, even routine. But nothing about these circumstances was ordinary. Mary was now in the final weeks of her pregnancy, her body carrying the child who would be called the Son of the Most High. Travel in her condition would be both physically demanding and potentially dangerous. Yet the Roman decree offered no exceptions, no postponements for personal need. The census swept across the entire empire, and every citizen was expected to comply. The timing seemed harsh from any human vantage point. Mary needed rest and the familiar comfort of her surroundings as her delivery drew near. She needed the steadying presence of other women, the warmth of her mother's home, the security of the people who had known her all her life. Instead, she faced a lengthy journey on foot or on the back of a donkey, sleeping in unfamiliar places, surrounded entirely by strangers. Joseph must have felt that weight of responsibility bearing down on him heavily. He had been charged with protecting both Mary and the unborn Messiah. Yet the circumstances were pushing them into a situation that lay entirely beyond his control. The carpenter, who could shape sturdy furniture with his hands, could not shape a road that would spare his wife the hardship of travel. His skills offered no defense against an imperial decree. Preparations for the journey required careful and deliberate planning. Joseph would need to bring tools of his trade, hoping to find work in Bethlehem and earn enough to cover their lodging. Mary would need clothing suited for travel and for giving birth, though their resources were modest. Food for the road, supplies for sleeping outdoors, money for unforeseen expenses, all of it had to be thought through and gathered. The couple joined the steady stream of travelers moving south toward Jerusalem and beyond. The roads were filled with families making the same kind of journey, all responding to the same census requirement. Dust rose in clouds behind moving caravans, and the constant mingling of voices, animals, and wagon wheels created an unbroken backdrop of noise along the way. Mary's discomfort grew with every mile they covered. Whether she rode a donkey, if they had managed to afford one, or walked alongside Joseph, the physical toll of traveling so close to her due date would have been exhausting beyond description. Joseph kept a watchful eye on her throughout, aware that their destination was still days ahead and that comfortable lodging remained far from guaranteed. The landscape shifted as they traveled southward. The green, rolling hills of Galilee gave way to drier, more rugged terrain as they approached Jerusalem. Olive trees and grapevines spread across the hillsides, and the road beneath their feet bore the smoothness of centuries of pilgrims, merchants, and armies who had passed before them. Every step brought them closer to the city where prophecy had long declared the Messiah would one day be born. The other travelers, sharing the road, each carried their own particular mix of hardship and anticipation. Some were genuinely glad for the chance to visit relatives they hadn't seen in years. Others complained openly about the disruption and expense the journey was costing them. Many simply pressed forward with quiet resignation, making the best of something they had no power to refuse. Mary and Joseph would have drawn encouragement from the company of other families navigating the same difficulties. The shared experience of pregnancy, travel, and uncertainty created real bonds, even between strangers. Women offered practical guidance and warm encouragement to Mary, while men banded together to look after their families on roads that were never entirely safe. As they neared Jerusalem, the crowds thickened noticeably. The holy city was a natural gathering point for travelers fanning out across Judea. The sight of the temple rising above its surrounding walls stirred something sacred in every Jewish heart, even as the more immediate concerns of lodging and supplies pressed close. The final stretch to Bethlehem proved the most grueling part of the journey. Mary's labor pains may already have been beginning, adding a sharp urgency to their need for shelter. The small town was packed with visitors, every one of them there for the same census registration. Every available room had already been taken. Every comfortable space had been claimed by those who had arrived ahead of them. Joseph's anxiety must have reached a near breaking point as he knocked on door after door, searching for any place suitable enough for his wife to give birth. Mary needed privacy, safety, and some form of assistance for the delivery that was clearly no longer far away. Yet door after door offered the same answer: no room, no space, no place at all for the birth of the Messiah. The irony cut deeply. The one who would be called the Prince of Peace could not find a single peaceful corner in which to be born. The young couple who had set out with faith and determination now faced their most difficult hour. Far from home, surrounded by strangers, with no comfortable shelter available, they confronted the reality that their child might arrive in the most humble setting imaginable. And yet, even in what looked like abandonment, God's plan was unfolding exactly as it was meant to. The road to Bethlehem had been long and punishing, but it had carried them to the precise location where prophecy required the Messiah to be born. The prophet Micah had written centuries before that from Bethlehem would come a ruler who would shepherd Israel. The census decree that seemed like nothing more than an inconvenient exercise of human power was, in truth, divine orchestration, ensuring that Jesus would be born in David's city. Mary's body was nearly spent, but her faith held firm. The child moving within her was the promise of God taking on flesh, and she trusted that the same God who had made his conception possible would also provide for his birth. The road had been hard, but the destination had been ordained from before the foundations of time. The journey was reaching its end, but the greatest story the world would ever know was only just beginning. The birth of Jesus, a quiet revolution. The small town of Bethlehem hummed and stirred with census visitors as evening shadows stretched long across the limestone hills. Mary's labor pains were growing stronger and more frequent, and Joseph's search for lodging had crossed from anxious into desperate. Door after door delivered the same discouraging answer: no room, no space, no place at all for a woman on the verge of giving birth. The town that by every right should have welcomed the Messiah seemed to have no place set aside for him. At last, one innkeeper looked at the young couple's obvious distress and let compassion move him to act. He had no proper room to offer, but he pointed them toward the only shelter he could provide, a cave or stable where animals were kept through the night. It was a humble space, carrying the smell of hay and livestock, but it offered the privacy they needed and a shield against the cool evening air. Mary and Joseph accepted with relief, knowing there was simply nothing else to be found. The stable was nothing at all like the comfortable birthing room Mary might have imagined for herself back in Nazareth, surrounded by her mother and other women who had been through this before. Instead, she had only Joseph's anxious attention and the quiet company of gentle animals sharing their temporary quarters. Yet, in this unlikely place, the most significant birth in all of human history was about to take place. Luke's account preserves the essential facts in words of remarkable simplicity. Mary gave birth to her firstborn son, wrapped him in strips of cloth, and laid him in a manger. Those few words carry within them the entire mystery of the Incarnation. God taking on human flesh, the infinite becoming finite, the eternal stepping into time through the birth of a young Jewish woman. The baby who drew his first breath in that stable carried within him the hopes and prayers of every generation that had come before. He was the seed of the woman promised to Eve, the son of Abraham, through whom all nations would be blessed, the descendant of David who would reign without end. Yet to every outward appearance, he was simply another newborn, small and vulnerable, entirely dependent on his mother's care. Mary's first sight of her son must have struck her with a force beyond anything she had words for. This was the child the angel had announced, the one conceived by the Holy Spirit, the Son of the Most High. And yet he was also her baby, warm and real against her skin, needing milk and comfort and the protection only she could offer him. Theological wonder and maternal love came together in that first moment of meeting in ways that no human language could fully capture. Joseph stood watching in deep amazement as the promises spoken to him in his dream became something he could see and hear and touch. The child Mary had carried through months of uncertainty was now breathing and crying in the lamplight of the stable. The carpenter, who had learned to shape wood with patient hands, now found himself witnessing God, shaping history through the birth of this tiny infant. The swaddling cloths Mary wrapped around Jesus were simple strips of cloth, exactly the kind every Jewish mother used to give her newborn a sense of security and warmth. Yet those ordinary pieces of fabric were pressed against the body of the Word made flesh, covering the one through whom all things had been created. The commonplace and the cosmic met in those simple strips of cloth. The manger that served as Jesus' first bed was a feeding trough for animals, carved from stone or built from timber. It was functional and clean enough, but utterly without grandeur. No place anyone would expect a king to rest his head. And yet it was the perfect cradle for the one who had come to overturn every earthly assumption about power and glory. The King of Kings began his earthly life in the place reserved for servants. In choosing such humble surroundings for the incarnation, God made a statement that rang louder than any proclamation from a royal court. The birth took place not in a palace, but in a stable. It was attended not by nobility, but by working people. It was announced not first to the powerful, but to ordinary shepherds tending their flocks. Heaven's ordering of priorities was nothing like what earth had come to expect. The quiet of that night was something beyond ordinary silence. While the Roman Empire celebrated its reach and wealth, while religious leaders maintained their careful observances, while the comfortable slept undisturbed in warm houses, the most important event in all of human history unfolded in near-complete silence. Only Mary, Joseph, and the animals present witnessed the moment salvation entered the world. Mary drew those first moments with her son close and held them there, committing every detail to memory as if she knew how precious they would one day become. The way he looked, the sound his cry made, the feel of his tiny fingers curled against her hand. All of it would remain with her through the years ahead as his destiny slowly revealed itself. She was not merely watching a birth, she was present at the beginning of redemption. The stable's humble setting made a clear and early statement about Jesus' identification with the poor and overlooked. He was born among the lowly, in conditions the wealthy would never have considered acceptable for their own children. From his very first breath, Jesus placed himself on the side of those whom society had forgotten, making plain that God's kingdom belonged in a special way to them. The physical reality of the birth was both entirely ordinary and entirely extraordinary at once. Mary experienced the same labor and effort as every woman who had ever given birth. Yet she was bringing into the world the one who would one day conquer death itself. The biological process unfolded naturally, while the identity of the child lay completely beyond the natural order. The animals present in the stable became silent witnesses to the incarnation. Their presence in such a setting was simply a matter of course, and these creatures, innocent of human sin, offered quiet companionship to the newborn who had come to bear the sins of the world. The contrast between the cosmic weight of what was happening and the utter simplicity of the setting produced a kind of beauty that only God could have arranged. The one who owned all things arrived owning nothing. The one who would one day judge the living and the dead was judged fit only for a stable. The one who would be proclaimed King of Kings began his life with livestock as his only court. As Mary held her newborn son, she must have thought of Hannah's song, of Sarah's laughter, of all the mothers across the long story of Israel who had waited and prayed for this moment. Their hopes and their prayers had gathered through the generations and now found their answer in the tiny form she cradled in her arms. Generations of faithful women had prepared the way for this birth through their own faithful surrender to God's purposes. Joseph's role in those first moments was protective and practical. He made sure Mary was as comfortable as the setting allowed, kept watch over their safety, and marveled at the fully human, perfectly real child he would raise as his own son. The carpenter had become the guardian of the cornerstone, the protector of the one who would build God's eternal kingdom with materials no human hands had ever touched. The birth of Jesus was the moment God's rescue plan for humanity moved from the realm of promise into the realm of reality. The word that had spoken creation into existence now made his first sound as a human infant. The hands that would heal the sick and break bread for the hungry were now small enough to wrap around a single finger. The feet that would one day walk across water now kicked and pushed helplessly inside their swaddling cloths. In the hush of that stable, heaven touched the earth so gently that the world barely stirred. And yet nothing would ever be the same again. The long waiting was over. The light of the world had been born. And though he lay in a feeding trough in a simple animal shelter, his birth was the dawning of an entirely new age. The visit of the Magi and the shadow of Herod. Sometime after Jesus' birth, once the Holy Family had moved from the stable into a house in Bethlehem, a group of remarkable visitors set out on a journey that would bring both wonder and grave danger into the nativity story. Far to the east, in the ancient lands of Persia or perhaps Arabia, learned men known as Magi had noticed something extraordinary moving through the night sky. A star unlike anything in their long experience of watching the heavens. These Magi were not kings, despite what later tradition would come to suggest, but scholars devoted to the careful study of celestial movement. In their day, the lines between astronomy and astrology were not clearly drawn, and unusual occurrences in the heavens were widely understood to signal significant events on Earth. What they observed in this star convinced them that a great king had been born, one worthy of a long and dangerous journey to find and properly honor. The Magi prepared for their expedition with the thoroughness of seasoned travelers. They gathered precious gifts appropriate for royalty: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Each of these offerings carried meaning that ran deeper than they may have realized. Gold for a king, frankincense for one who was divine, myrrh for one who would face mortality. Without knowing the full truth of it, they had assembled gifts that spoke perfectly to the nature of the child they were seeking. Their caravan would have presented an impressive sight as it moved westward, camels loaded with supplies and treasures, servants tending the animals and standing guard against the bandits who preyed on desert routes, provisions enough for months of travel. Word of their passage spread along the trade roads ahead of them, stirring curiosity wherever they went about their destination and their purpose. The journey carried them through territories governed by various rulers, each with their own laws and dangers. Desert stretches tested their endurance. Mountain passes demanded careful navigation. Yet the star continued to appear, night after night, confirming the direction they had chosen and renewing their determination to press forward. When the Magi finally entered Judea, they made the reasonable assumption that a royal birth of this significance would be common knowledge in the capital city. Their arrival in Jerusalem created a considerable stir as they moved through its streets openly asking, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." The question sent unsettling ripples through the entire city. King Herod the Great, now aging and consumed by the kind of paranoia that had shadowed his long reign, was profoundly disturbed by reports of these foreign visitors searching for another king. His years in power had been defined by political calculation and the ruthless removal of anyone he saw as a potential threat to his throne, including members of his own family. Herod summoned the chief priests and teachers of the law and demanded to know where the Messiah was prophesied to be born. Their answer came directly from the prophet Micah, "But you, Bethlehem in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." The king's response was entirely in keeping with the cunning that had kept him in power so long. Rather than reveal what he was actually planning, he arranged a private meeting with the Magi and carefully determined the exact time the star had first appeared. Then he sent them on their way to Bethlehem with an instruction wrapped in false sincerity: "Go and search carefully for the child. Once you find him, bring word back to me, so that I too may go and worship him." The Magi continued south to Bethlehem, with no awareness of the deadly trap being constructed around them. When the star appeared once more and came to rest over the precise location where Jesus was, they were filled with overwhelming joy. Their long journey was reaching its end at last. The child they had traveled so far and endured so much to find was now within reach. They found Jesus in a house with Mary, his mother, which suggests that a meaningful amount of time had passed since the night of his birth in the stable. The child may have been anywhere from several months to close to 2 years old, no longer a newborn, but still clearly the one they had come seeking. The simplicity of the surroundings may well have surprised men who expected to find royalty housed in grandeur. Even so, they recognized what they had found. They bowed low and worshipped the child, acknowledging his royal and divine nature without reservation. Then they opened the treasures they had carried so far and presented their gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. These precious offerings would, in the near future, prove to be far more than symbolic. They would become the practical means of the family's survival. Mary watched these exotic visitors honor her son with a mixture of deep wonder and quiet unease. Their obvious wealth and their foreign appearance drew attention to her family in ways that felt dangerous, while their public questions about a newborn king could only add to the risks gathering around them. Even so, their worship was a powerful confirmation of everything the angel had spoken to her about her son's identity. Joseph received the Magi's gifts with genuine gratitude, perhaps already sensing that divine providence was placing resources in his hands that he would soon urgently need. The gold, especially, would prove essential for funding what was about to become an unexpected and immediate flight, and for supporting the family through a stretch of time when his carpentry work would offer nothing. The Magi's visit had transformed Jesus from a local curiosity into something with international dimensions. Word of foreign scholars traveling to Judea in search of a newborn Jewish king would inevitably make its way back to Herod through the web of informants that sustained his grip on power. The child's safety, already fragile given his prophetic significance, was now actively threatened by a king whose fear had no limits. After their time of worship and gift-giving, the Magi prepared to return to Herod as they had agreed. But God stepped in through a dream, warning them plainly not to go back anywhere near the murderous king. As with the other dreams that had shaped this story, Mary's angelic visitation, Joseph's reassuring vision, divine revelation once again redirected human plans to serve heaven's larger design. The wise men chose an entirely different route home, avoiding Jerusalem altogether. Their departure left Herod waiting for news that would never arrive. And in choosing not to cooperate with evil, they became an unwitting but essential part of God's plan to protect the Holy Family. The Magi's visit also marked the first recognition of Jesus by the Gentile world. These foreign scholars had traveled greater distances and sacrificed far more to come and worship the newborn king than many within his own people would ever choose to do. Their journey foreshadowed the worldwide reach of the gospel and the drawing of all nations into God's great salvation story. Their gifts, in the meantime, provided practical provision for the hard days ahead. The gold would fund a flight into Egypt. The frankincense and myrrh could be converted into ongoing support. God's provision arrived, as it so often does, through channels no one would have anticipated, using the devotion of foreign travelers to meet the urgent needs of his holy family. As the Magi disappeared into the distance along roads carefully chosen to keep them well away from Herod's reach, they left behind a child whose life was now marked for destruction by earthly power. But they also left behind gifts that would make his survival possible, and parents who had received fresh and unmistakable confirmation of his divine calling. The shadow of Herod's rage was already spreading across Bethlehem, but the light of the world had been properly honored by those who had eyes to see what others missed. The contrast between the Magi's reverent worship and Herod's violent scheming captured perfectly the choice that Jesus' presence would always place before the world: humble adoration or furious rejection. There would be no neutral ground. Escape to Egypt. Darkness covered Bethlehem when Mary stirred from uneasy sleep. Joseph's urgent voice cut through the silence, low but sharp with purpose. An angel had spoken to him in a dream, carrying a warning. Danger was moving closer with every hour that passed. Herod's soldiers would soon come looking for the child that the prophets called the newborn king. Mary gathered their few possessions with hands that trembled. Baby Jesus slept peacefully in her arms, unaware that his very existence was seen as a threat to a throne. She drew him closer against the cool night air, her heart pushing hard against her ribs with fear and confusion all tangled together. How could this innocent child be a danger to anyone? The journey to Egypt began under a sky full of stars. Joseph led their donkey along paths worn into the dust, glancing back over his shoulder at regular intervals. Mary held Jesus close and whispered prayers into the dark around them. Every step they took carried them further from everything they had ever known, deeper into an unknown wilderness stretching toward a foreign country. Days folded into weeks as they traveled southward. The landscape around them changed steadily, the rolling hills of Judea giving way to the harshness of desert terrain. Water had to be rationed carefully. Food became harder to come by. Mary's body still ached from the effort of childbirth, yet she kept moving without complaint through every mile. Her son's safety meant more to her than her own comfort ever could. They joined caravans of traders when the opportunity arose, finding safety in traveling with larger groups. Mary listened to conversations in languages she did not understand and observed foreign customs with quiet, curious eyes. Egypt waited ahead of them like a distant promise, a place where even Rome's reach might offer some protection from Herod's particular brand of fury. Crossing into Egyptian territory brought a complicated mix of relief and grief. They were safe now, yes, but they were also exiles. Mary looked back in the direction of the land her ancestors had called home and wondered how long it would be before she saw it again. The weight of prophecy settled on her shoulders alongside the weight of exile. Her son was destined for greatness, but the path beneath their feet seemed to be paved with suffering. Alexandria received them within its noisy, sprawling markets and its remarkable mix of peoples. Jewish communities had put down roots here across many generations, creating familiar pockets of culture within the broader Egyptian world. Mary found real comfort among women who shared her faith, even as she kept the deepest truths about Jesus locked away inside her heart. Life in exile gradually found its shape and rhythm. Joseph located work, his skilled hands crafting furniture and tools that Egyptian customers valued and sought out. Mary cared for Jesus, watching him grow from infant to toddler on foreign soil. She taught him words in Hebrew and sang him songs from their homeland, keeping the thread of their heritage alive in a place so different from where they had come. News from Palestine reached them through traveling merchants and pilgrims who moved along the same routes. The word of Herod's massacre in Bethlehem arrived like a physical impact. Mary wept for the mothers who had lost their children in those terrible hours, knowing in the deepest part of herself that her son's survival had come at the cost of their suffering. Guilt and gratitude pressed against each other in her prayers each night, inseparable and raw. Jesus took his first steps and spoke his first words during their time in Egypt. Mary marveled at his quick mind and the gentleness that seemed built into his spirit, wondering what divine nature might be quietly stirring within this child, who appeared, in almost every way, entirely ordinary. He played alongside other children, picked up Egyptian words with ease, and adapted to the rhythms of their new home with the natural flexibility of the young. Years moved through that suspended existence. Mary passed from girlhood into womanhood, raising her son in a land that never quite became home, no matter how familiar it grew. She dreamed of Nazareth's narrow, well-known streets and the warmth of her mother's arms around her. But she also grew stronger during those years, faith deepening in ways it could only deepen through sustained hardship and sustained trust. The angel came to Joseph again in a dream, as clear and direct as the first time. Herod was dead. The immediate threat had passed. They were free to return to Palestine. Mary felt joy and apprehension in roughly equal measure. Egypt had grown familiar, settled, almost safe. Going back would mean stepping into uncertainty once more. They packed their belongings with the same careful attention they had brought to their flight, but this time hope was what they carried alongside their things, rather than fear. Jesus was older now, capable of walking short distances beside the donkey, rather than always being carried. He chatted and asked questions about the journey with a child's straightforward excitement, having no way to grasp what this return meant to his parents on a level far deeper than geography. The road back into Palestine retraced the steps of their earlier escape. Mary recognized landmarks along the way that fear and darkness had obscured when they first passed them. Now she saw them clearly, and in each one she read evidence of God's protection over their entire time away. Her faith had been shaped and strengthened in the desert in ways she was only beginning to understand. Crossing back into Jewish territory, Mary felt something settle around her, like a familiar covering. The language, the customs, the unspoken rhythms of life here reached something in the center of her. Yet she brought Egypt back with her too, experiences that had stretched her understanding of God's world in ways she would not have otherwise known. The years of exile had changed all three of them in ways that were hard to fully name. Joseph walked with a confidence that had been earned through hardship and divine guidance rather than simply given. Jesus had grown into a bright, curious child who had already seen more of the world than most grown men. And Mary had learned in the most direct possible way that following God's will sometimes meant releasing everything familiar, trusting that love would remain visible on the path, even in the dark. Return to Nazareth. Years in obscurity. The hills of Galilee welcomed them back with gentle slopes and stones that felt like old friends. Nazareth came into view like a gift held back until just the right moment. Mary's heart moved faster as she recognized the narrow streets where she had spent her girlhood. And yet, everything seemed somehow smaller than she remembered, as though her years in Egypt had quietly enlarged her sense of the world around her. Their old house stood empty, worn by years of no one living inside it. Joseph began repairs without delay, his hands returning naturally to work they understood. Mary swept away dust and cobwebs, slowly bringing the space back to life. Jesus moved through each room with the pleased wonder of a child, claiming new territory as his own. Neighbors appeared cautiously at first, uncertain how to approach the family that had vanished without clear explanation so many years before. Mary offered simple answers about their time away, sharing enough truth to quiet curiosity without opening the door to the deeper story. Gradually, as days and weeks passed, acceptance replaced the initial guardedness, and the community remembered what they had always valued in Joseph's steady dependability and Mary's quiet kindness. Life in Nazareth reclaimed its gentle, predictable pace. Joseph reopened his workshop and began patiently rebuilding relationships with customers who had missed what his hands could do. The familiar sounds of hammer and saw filled the daylight hours once more, providing a comforting soundtrack of ordinary living that Mary had nearly forgotten what it felt like to hear. Jesus began spending time with other children in the village. Mary noticed, though, how he often stood slightly to one side of their games, watching them with thoughtful attention before joining in. He learned quickly in whatever arena he turned his attention to, whether childhood play or the more serious matter of Jewish customs and religious practice. His questions had a habit of catching adults off guard, with the depth sitting quietly behind them. The synagogue became the center of their family's weekly life once more. Mary listened as Jesus recited Hebrew prayers with growing confidence, his young voice winding into the prayers of older men who had known the same words since their own boyhood. She could see how intently he absorbed the Torah readings and the words of the prophets, as if each passage was finding a place inside him that had already been prepared to receive it. The daily routines of village life brought comfort after the long instability of their years away. Mary rose before dawn to prepare bread, her hands remembering what her mind had almost let go of. She walked to the village well and joined other women in the kind of woven-together conversations that hold a community's life in place. These ordinary moments felt like gifts she had not fully appreciated before she had known what it was to live without them. Joseph brought Jesus into the workshop and began teaching him the carpenter's trade, showing him how to select good wood and handle tools with care and respect. The boy's hands, though still small, showed a natural aptitude and the patience that good work requires. Mary watched from doorways as father and son bent their heads together over shared tasks that would serve their neighbors' practical needs. Seasons came and went in their reliable order. Spring scattered wildflowers across the Galilean hillsides where Jesus loved to walk. Summer's heat drove families indoors during the middle hours of the day. Autumn harvests filled storage spaces with grain and oil against the winter ahead. Winter rains drummed steadily against rooftops, while families drew close around small fires and told their stories. Mary stored up these peaceful years as if they were things of great value, which they were. She sensed, in the way a person sometimes senses what they cannot yet see, that this quiet season was preparation for something that could not be undone once it began. The angel's words returned to her memory during ordinary moments, reminding her that her son's calling reached far beyond carpentry and the life of a village. Jesus grew taller, and his shoulders broadened. The child's body was stretching steadily toward the man he would become. Mary caught glimpses of something ancient and deep in his eyes at unexpected moments, flashes of understanding that seemed far too settled for his years. And yet he was thoroughly human in every other way, quick to laugh at something genuinely funny, and just as quick to cry out in pain when he scraped a knee on the workshop floor. Religious festivals brought the family south to Jerusalem each year, joining the pilgrims who streamed in from every direction across Palestine. Mary watched Jesus' face during these journeys and saw how the temple's magnitude stirred something profound and irreducible in him. During the festival visits themselves, he asked fewer questions than usual, as if absorbing rather than actively seeking, filling some interior reservoir without yet drawing from it. The learning never paused. Jesus moved through Scripture with a facility that regularly impressed the rabbis who visited their synagogue, though he always brought his insights forward with a humility that kept them from feeling like performances. He applied himself with equal seriousness to the practical skills Joseph taught him, becoming genuinely accomplished with tools and timber. Mary found herself marveling, not for the first time, at how naturally he held spiritual depth and earthly competence together. Village life carried its portion of grief alongside its quiet satisfactions. Mary moved among her neighbors through their illnesses and losses, offering the steadying presence she had developed through her own long trials. Jesus often came with her on these visits, and she noticed how his presence itself seemed to bring something calmer and more hopeful into rooms that had been heavy with trouble. Years accumulated the way sediment does, each one adding depth to the family's story while leaving the surface looking entirely unremarkable. To the people of Nazareth, they were a carpenter's family, living devout, quiet lives. Only Mary and Joseph carried the full knowledge of who they were actually raising, in what kind of humble disguise. The child grew in wisdom and in stature, finding favor with God and with the people around him, just as the record would later say. Mary watched that growth with a wonder that never quite became ordinary, and with an increasing awareness that the season of hiddenness was slowly, inevitably, drawing toward its close. Change was approaching the way morning light approaches from the east, gradual and certain and impossible to stop. These hidden years shaped Jesus in ways that no palace education and no royal tutor could ever have accomplished. He learned compassion by watching what his neighbors actually carried. He learned hard work through hands, made rough by real labor. He learned what it meant to be human by living fully within it, sharing its limits and discovering its possibilities from the inside. Mary treasured all of it, just as she had treasured the shepherd's words and the angel's songs in the lamplight of a Bethlehem stable years before. Each ordinary day added one more thread to the tapestry God was patiently weaving around his son. The hidden years would end soon enough, and Jesus would step out into the full light of public ministry. But they were not over yet. The boy in the temple. Jerusalem blazed with the particular energy that descended on it each Passover as crowds packed every street and open space. Mary walked beside Joseph, keeping pace with the familiar rhythm of a pilgrimage that had marked their family's spring season for years. Jesus, 12 years old now, moved with sure, confident steps among the relatives and neighbors who formed their traveling group. The ancient stones of the city seemed to pulse with something larger than the present moment during these holy days. Mary felt the weight of centuries pressing out from the temple walls, holding all who entered within the long memory of God's covenant with his people. Jesus walked quietly beside her, his eyes moving steadily over everything they passed, and everything he saw seemed to stir something in the deepest part of him that she could not quite name. The days of Passover were fully consumed by preparation and practice. Mary assisted with the ritual meal, working herbs and setting aside the unleavened bread, according to traditions that had been handed down through more generations than anyone could count. Jesus helped wherever he could, his hands taking on the sacred rhythms, even as his mind absorbed their fuller meaning. The temple drew him with a force that went beyond ordinary curiosity. Mary noticed how he lingered there during their formal visits, his attention held by the priests performing the ancient ceremonies, his questions growing more layered and more searching. They were less like the questions of a child gathering facts, and more like the questions of a scholar, following a line of thought towards something he could sense but had not yet fully reached. The festival week passed in a blur of worship, family time, and ceremonial meals. Mary felt the deep, settled satisfaction that came from honoring obligations that connected her family to their ancestors and to their God. The journey home to Nazareth would carry them back to ordinary life, but they would carry renewed spiritual strength with them, enough to sustain another year. The departure from Jerusalem began with the usual organized chaos of a large group preparing to move. Families gathered their belongings. Farewells stretched on between relatives who lived in different regions. Mary assumed Jesus was moving somewhere within the larger group, perhaps walking with cousins or sitting with uncles who were sharing stories along the dusty road. She had no reason yet to be concerned. Hours went by before unease began to grow in her chest. She realized she had not actually seen Jesus since the morning. She had not thought much of it because their traveling company included so many relatives, any one of whom might have drawn him into conversation or invited him to walk alongside them. But as the afternoon light began to angle low and long across the road, she understood she could not remember anyone specifically mentioning him. The truth arrived like a physical shock. Jesus was not anywhere in their traveling group. No one had laid eyes on him since they had left Jerusalem. The entire group had traveled a full day's journey, while everyone quietly assumed someone else had him in sight. Mary's heart hammered as the weight of what had happened fully landed on her. Joseph's face went pale in the same moment. They would have to turn around immediately and go back to Jerusalem, leaving their group to continue without them. Their 12-year-old son was alone in a city that was large enough and crowded enough to swallow him entirely. The thought threatened to collapse all rational thinking into pure panic. The walk back to Jerusalem felt as though it would never end, despite how urgently they were moving. Mary's mind produced one frightening possibility after another. He could be lost. He could be hurt. He could have been taken by someone whose intentions she did not want to think about. The city's maze of streets and its countless corners could keep a child hidden. Her prayers came in fragments, each one a desperate reaching toward God, with nothing to offer but fear and need. Night fell before they reached the city gates. Mary spent those hours without sleep, imagining Jesus frightened and alone somewhere in the dark, calling for parents who had not known to stay. The guilt was suffocating. How could she have been so careless with the child God himself had placed in her care? Dawn came and they searched again, moving through Jerusalem's streets and markets with mounting desperation. They stopped merchants, beggars, anyone they could find who might have noticed a boy alone. Mary's voice wore itself raw from calling his name. Her feet bled from the pace across rough stone. Still they found nothing. 2 full days passed in this agony. Mary barely stopped to eat or sleep, driven by a desperation that was producing endurance beyond what she could have found in herself under ordinary circumstances. Joseph searched with the same relentless determination, his carpenter's practical mind working through the city systematically, while his father's heart cracked open a little more with every failed inquiry. The 3rd day brought them to the temple courts, at nearly the point where Mary had begun to give up hope of finding him unharmed. It was voices that caught their attention first, a gathering of people around several learned teachers. In the center of the group sat a young boy, listening with full attention and offering questions that were drawing genuine nods from men who had spent their lives studying these texts. It was Jesus, alive, safe, completely absorbed in theological discussion, with not a trace of concern visible in his posture or expression. Mary felt relief and anger arrive at precisely the same instant, 2 waves striking from opposite directions. Every impulse she had wanted to pull him close and scold him simultaneously. How could he look so entirely at ease when they had been through 3 days of sheer anguish? The teachers looked up as Mary and Joseph pushed through toward the boy, their expressions registering mild surprise at the interruption. Jesus turned to face his parents, and his expression was one of gentle confusion, as though their obvious distress genuinely puzzled him. Mary's words came out in a rush of everything she had been carrying for 3 days. Why had he done this to them? Did he not understand what they had gone through? His father and she had been searching with desperate fear, turning the city over looking for him. His answer hit her with the force of something she could feel, but not yet see clearly. Why had they searched? Did they not know he would be in his father's house? That he had to be about his father's business? The words carried layers she could sense without yet being able to unfold them. Something profound was moving just beneath the surface of what he had said, something about who he understood himself to be and what he understood his life to be for. She could not quite grasp it, but she felt it, and she knew she would be turning it over for a long time. The teachers watched the reunion with respectful restraint, clearly moved by the boy's wisdom, but sensitive to the parents' exhaustion and relief. Jesus rose without argument when Joseph indicated it was time to leave. But as Mary took him by the hand, she caught something in his eyes, a glimpse of something vast and unhurried, that made her feel for a moment as though she were holding a stranger who happened to be wearing her son's familiar face. They left the temple courts together, but Mary carried the feeling with her as they walked. The child who had engaged those learned men as an equal seemed subtly different from the boy who had swept sawdust in the workshop just weeks before. The journey back to Nazareth moved in a contemplative quiet. Jesus walked between his parents without complaint, and he did not seem troubled. Mary sensed, though, that part of him had stayed behind in that courtyard, still turning over ideas and insights that belonged to a world beyond anything a childhood in Nazareth had prepared either of them to fully enter with him. That night, camped with other travelers heading north, Mary lay awake beneath the stars while Jesus slept peacefully at her side. The angel's announcement from long ago moved through her memory again, reminding her that this child's destiny reached far beyond the ordinary life of a village family. Today had allowed a brief, startling glimpse of what that greater calling might look like. She folded the memory carefully and kept it alongside all the other mysterious things she had been storing in her heart since before he was born. Someday, perhaps, it would all become clear. For now, she could only continue watching and wondering as her son grew steadily toward a future that remained held within God's own timing. The silent years. A mother's watchful eye. Morning light pushed itself through the wooden shutters in thin lines as Mary stirred grain into porridge, her hands moving with the ease of a rhythm repeated across countless dawns. Jesus sat near her, already dressed and alert despite the early hour. At 17, he had grown tall, and his shoulders had taken on the breadth that came from real physical work shared with Joseph throughout each day. These quiet years had grown precious to Mary, though she held them gently, sensing that they were not without limit. Jesus moved through daily life with a steady thoughtfulness that was still growing, as if each ordinary task were carrying more meaning than others around him were able to perceive. She watched him carefully, attentive to the subtle changes that marked his passage from boyhood toward manhood. The workshop drew him as naturally as a second home. He had taken up every tool Joseph had to teach him, and his hands crafted furniture and implements that neighbors came back to ask for by name, praising the quality and the care built into every piece. And yet Mary noticed how he would sometimes stop mid-work, his gaze moving out toward distant hills, his eyes holding a focus that seemed aimed at something further than anything visible. Evening hours belonged to Scripture. Jesus read Torah and the prophets with an intensity that left an impression on even the learned rabbis who occasionally came through their synagogue. His questions during these exchanges revealed an understanding that reached well beyond his years, though the humility with which he asked them kept any appearance of presumption well out of sight. Village life maintained its familiar patterns around them. Mary took part in the gatherings of women, passing along news and concerns while her hands stayed busy with spinning or weaving. She listened to the recurring troubles of taxes, weather, and family difficulty, offering what comfort she could, all the while keeping her own profound knowledge carefully hidden in the same interior place she had always kept it. Jesus was always ready to help wherever help was needed. He assisted older neighbors with tasks their own strength could no longer manage. He carried water for women whose energy had given out. He spent time with the younger children who attached themselves to him in groups, pulled by the gentleness in his manner and the seemingly bottomless permissions he brought to their games and their endless small questions. Mary found herself returning again and again to the mystery of how completely he had learned what it meant to be human, while something in him clearly was not only human. The two natures revealed themselves not through dramatic events, but in the smaller details of ordinary life. He got hungry, he grew tired, he felt pain just as anyone did. Yet something about his presence seemed to offer peace to people who had come in carrying something heavier than the rest of them could see. Religious festivals continued to bring the family south to Jerusalem, though those journeys had taken on an additional layer of meaning since the incident at the temple years before. Mary studied Jesus during worship, watching the way he received every word and gesture with a reverence that seemed to go all the way down. He appeared to be in preparation for something, steadily and deliberately, though what it was and when it would begin remained out of sight. The wilderness called to him with increasing regularity. Jesus took long, solitary walks into lonely stretches of land and came home with dust on his sandals and something deeper in his eyes than had been there when he left. A depth that spoke of conversation with something she could not see and did not fully understand. Mary never questioned these quiet departures, trusting that they were necessary in ways that lay beyond her ability to ask about. Young men around his age were beginning to take wives and set up their own households. Mary observed how the village girls noticed Jesus, though he appeared entirely unaware of their attention. His focus remained on matters of faith, family obligation, and the quiet service he gave freely to those around him. He showed none of the interest in romantic attachment that occupied the thoughts of most young men his age. Joseph's health began to show the wear of accumulating years, though he carried his increasing limitations with the same patience he had always brought to difficult things. Jesus absorbed more and more of the workshop's demands without ever being asked, taking on burdens that would have taxed men decades older than himself. Mary watched how he stepped into that growing leadership naturally, never in a way that made Joseph feel diminished. News from the wider world arrived in Nazareth through merchants and travelers passing through. Roman taxation pressed harder each year. Political tensions simmered through Palestine like something coming slowly to a boil. Religious leaders in Jerusalem argued with greater urgency over the interpretation of law and prophecy. Jesus listened to all of it with careful, quiet attention, rarely offering his own view. Mary's inner life deepened steadily through these hidden years. Prayer became the constant companion that held everything else together, as she sought wisdom for the task of raising a son whose destiny surpassed anything she had found in Scripture to prepare her for it. She learned to rest in silence. She learned to trust God's timing, even when the unanswered questions multiplied faster than any answer came. The boy was becoming a man, but what kind of man he was becoming and what would be required of him and of her when he finally stepped into the open was still held within the part of the future that only God could see. Mary noticed a growing restlessness stirring beneath the surface of Jesus' spirit, as if he could sense the approach of a great change before it had taken any visible shape. He fulfilled every daily responsibility with unwavering faithfulness, but she felt it, the way you feel a shift in the air before a storm, a sense that he was standing at the very edge of a transformation that, once it began, would reshape everything. Dreams came to her sometimes, quiet echoes of angelic announcements that had marked the beginning of Jesus' life. These nighttime visions carried no specific messages, only gentle reminders that God's plan continued moving forward according to divine timing. Mary would wake from such dreams with a renewed commitment to patient watchfulness. Community responsibilities multiplied as Jesus grew older. He mediated disputes between neighbors with a wisdom that left older men speechless. He organized help for families going through hardship. He taught younger boys carpentry skills with the same patient thoroughness Joseph had once shown him. Leadership rose naturally from his character rather than from any desire for recognition. The learning never stopped. Jesus studied with visiting scholars whenever the chance arose, entering into discussions that often stretched well into the late-night hours. Mary served simple meals to these educated men, listening quietly as her son explored questions about the law, prophecy, and God's relationship with his people. Physical strength reached its peak during those years. Jesus could work longer hours than men decades older than himself. Yet he remained gentle with those whose abilities were limited by age or illness. Power and humility blended together seamlessly in his character, forming a combination that seemed impossible and yet was undeniably real. Mary held tightly to these final years of relative normalcy, knowing deep in her spirit that dramatic change was approaching, like storm clouds building on a distant horizon. Soon, very soon, her son would step beyond the familiar edges of village life and into a larger world that waited for his arrival. Until that day, she watched and wondered and prayed, storing up memories against the uncertain future that beckoned from beyond tomorrow's dawn. The wedding at Cana. Mary the catalyst. Spring had dressed Galilee in wedding finery when the invitation arrived from Cana. Mary felt genuine joy at the thought of celebration after months of ordinary village routine. Jesus, now 30 years old, agreed to go with her to the festivities, though she noticed how he seemed to weigh even simple decisions more carefully these days. The journey to Cana carried them through countryside bursting with new life. Wildflowers carpeted the hillsides in brilliant color, while fresh green leaves unfolded on every tree. Mary walked beside Jesus, savoring rare time for unhurried conversation as they covered the familiar miles between villages. Wedding preparations had turned Cana into a festival ground. Garlands draped between houses, while musicians tuned their instruments for days of celebration ahead. Mary smiled at the contagious joy surrounding a young couple beginning their lives together. These occasions reminded her of humanity's deep capacity for hope, despite life's inevitable hardships. The ceremony itself followed ancient traditions that connected this couple to countless generations who had spoken similar vows beneath similar skies. Mary watched the bride's radiant face and remembered her own wedding to Joseph, though that seemed like a memory from another lifetime. So much had shifted since those early days of marriage. Jesus took part in the celebration with quiet grace, though she noticed how he often stood slightly apart from the crowd, observing rather than fully joining in. His presence brought a calm to the festive atmosphere without dampening anyone's spirits. People seemed drawn to him without quite understanding why. The feast began with abundant food and wine flowing freely among guests who had traveled from neighboring villages to honor the new couple. Mary enjoyed conversations with old friends she rarely saw, catching up on family news and sharing stories that wove their lives together despite the distances between them. Hours passed in pleasant celebration until Mary became aware of worried whispers moving among the servants. She listened carefully and understood their concern. The wine was running dangerously low. For a wedding feast to run out of wine would bring a shame on both families that could last for years. The joy of the celebration threatened to dissolve into humiliation. Mary felt the familiar stirring in her spirit that had preceded so many significant moments throughout her life. She looked toward Jesus, seeing him standing near the edge of the courtyard with that thoughtful expression that meant he was wrestling with something important. Somehow she knew this moment had arrived for reasons that went beyond coincidence. She approached her son quietly, speaking words that would echo through history. "They have no wine." Simple words that carried layers of meaning she could not fully put into words. She sensed this crisis offered an opening for something greater than solving a social embarrassment, though what that might be remained unclear. Jesus' response surprised her with its apparent distance. "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." The formal address stung slightly, though she recognized it carried respect rather than dismissal. More puzzling was his reference to an hour that had not yet arrived. What hour? What timing was he measuring? Yet something in his eyes told her differently than his words suggested. Mary had learned to read her son's expressions over 30 years of motherhood. Behind his seeming reluctance, she detected readiness, even anticipation. Perhaps the hour he mentioned was closer than his words implied. Without fully understanding her own certainty, Mary turned to the servant standing nearby, clearly distressed about the wine shortage. Her instructions were simple yet profound. "Whatever he tells you, do it." The words came from faith rather than knowledge, from trust rather than understanding. 6 stone water jars stood near the entrance, used for ceremonial washing according to Jewish custom. Each jar could hold 20 or 30 gallons, massive containers that would require considerable effort to fill. Jesus gestured toward them, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made the servants respond without hesitation. "Fill the jars with water," he instructed. The servants exchanged uncertain glances, but began the laborious work of drawing water and pouring it into the enormous containers. Mary watched the process with growing anticipation, though she had no idea what Jesus intended to accomplish with all that water. When the jars were filled to their brim, Jesus spoke again. "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the feast." Mary held her breath as a servant filled a cup from one of the jars and carried it toward the man responsible for overseeing the wedding celebration. The master of the feast lifted the cup to his lips, his expression moving from dutiful obligation to surprise to absolute delight. He immediately called for the bridegroom, his voice carrying an excitement that made nearby guests turn their attention toward the exchange. Mary could not hear the master's exact words, but his gestures and tone communicated amazement. He was praising the quality of whatever he had just tasted, apparently astonished that such exceptional refreshment had been saved for so late in the celebration. Other guests began to gather, curious about what had caused such enthusiasm. Word spread quickly through the crowd that somehow, miraculously, the finest wine anyone had ever tasted was now flowing abundantly from containers that had held only water moments before. Mary watched Jesus as realization dawned on the guests around them. His first miracle had been performed quietly, without fanfare or announcement. The transformation was complete and undeniable. Water had become wine, but not just any wine. This was superior to anything served earlier, rich and full-bodied in ways that made even experienced wedding guests marvel at its quality. The celebration's threatened disaster had become its greatest triumph. Jesus stepped back from the growing excitement. But Mary saw how several of his disciples looked at him with new understanding. They had witnessed something that confirmed their growing conviction about his identity. What had begun as a social favor had become a revelation of divine power. Mary treasured this moment as she had treasured so many others throughout Jesus' life. She had played a part in prompting his first public miracle, though she had not fully understood what she was setting in motion. Her simple faith in her son's abilities had opened a door that would never close again. The wedding celebration continued with renewed energy, fueled by wine that seemed to deepen rather than diminish as the evening progressed. But Mary knew something fundamental had changed. Jesus had crossed an invisible threshold from private preparation into public ministry. The hidden years were ending, and the world would never be the same. During the rise of Jesus' ministry, word traveled faster than Jesus himself. Reports of his teachings and miracles spread throughout Galilee like ripples moving outward from a stone dropped into still water. Mary heard fragments of these stories from neighbors, merchants, and pilgrims who passed through Nazareth, carrying tales that both thrilled and troubled her maternal heart. Her son had gathered followers, men who had left their fishing nets and tax tables to walk the dusty roads behind a carpenter from their own village. Mary struggled to reconcile these reports with memories of the boy who had helped Joseph plane boards and fit joints with patient precision. Yet, she had always known this day would come. The synagogue in Nazareth buzzed with conflicting opinions about Jesus' growing reputation. Some neighbors felt proud that their village had produced such a remarkable teacher. Others muttered about presumption and wondered aloud how Joseph's son dared to speak with an authority that challenged established religious leaders. Mary listened to both the praise and the criticism with careful silence. Crowds began seeking Jesus wherever he went, drawn by a healing power that restored sight to blind eyes and strength to withered limbs. Mary marveled at these reports while remembering the gentle hands that had once helped her knead bread and tend their small garden. Those same hands now channeled divine power that transformed broken lives. His teachings drew even larger crowds than his miracles. People walked for days just to hear Jesus speak about God's kingdom in ways that made ancient truths feel fresh and alive. Mary wished she could hear these teachings herself, though she understood why he rarely returned to Nazareth. Prophets found little honor in their own country, as he had discovered during one particularly painful homecoming. The disciples became like a second family to Jesus, sharing his travels and absorbing his teachings with a devotion that reminded Mary of her own relationship with God's calling. She felt gratitude toward these men who provided her son with companionship and support during his demanding ministry. Yet she also felt the natural ache of a mother who must share her child with the world. Reports of opposition began mixing with stories of success. Religious authorities in Jerusalem were taking notice of Jesus' growing influence, and their attention was not entirely friendly. Mary's maternal instincts quickened with worry as she realized her son was making enemies among powerful people who could cause serious trouble. Pilgrims returning from Jerusalem brought disturbing news of increasing tension between Jesus and the established religious hierarchy. Pharisees and scribes were beginning to challenge his teachings publicly, setting traps designed to discredit him before the crowds. Mary remembered prophecies about suffering and wondered if these conflicts were early signs of sorrows yet to come. The demands of ministry left little time for family visits. Jesus moved constantly throughout Galilee, teaching in synagogues, healing in marketplaces, and sharing meals with crowds that gathered wherever he appeared. Mary understood his dedication to this calling. Yet her heart ached for the simple conversations they had once shared around their family table. Stories reached her of Jesus dining with tax collectors and sinners, choices that scandalized religious leaders but revealed his heart for outcasts and broken people. Mary felt proud of her son's compassion, even as she worried about the religious establishment's growing hostility toward his unconventional methods. The miracles multiplied beyond anything anyone had anticipated, feeding thousands with a few loaves and fish, calming storms with spoken words, raising the dead back to life. Mary struggled to reconcile these supernatural acts with memories of the human child she had nursed and taught and loved through ordinary days in Nazareth. His parables became famous throughout Palestine, simple stories that unlocked profound spiritual truths for those with ears to hear. Mary recognized her son's wisdom in these teachings, recalling conversations that had hinted at the depth of understanding he now shared with crowds of eager listeners. The religious establishment's opposition intensified as Jesus' popularity grew. Reports reached Mary of plots and schemes designed to trap him in controversial statements or compromising situations. She prayed constantly for his safety, knowing that his ministry had made him a target for those who felt threatened by his message. John the Baptist's arrest and execution sent shockwaves throughout Palestine, reminding everyone that challenging religious and political authority carried deadly risks. Mary's anxiety deepened as she recognized that Jesus' message was even more radical than John's had been. If Herod could execute the Baptist, what might he do to her son? The crowds continued to grow, sometimes numbering in the thousands, as people traveled from across Palestine to see and hear Jesus. Mary felt wonder at God's power working through her son. Yet she also felt increasing concern about the dangers of managing such large gatherings in a politically unstable environment. Letters and messages from the disciples occasionally brought news directly from Jesus' traveling company. Mary treasured these communications, learning about her son's daily life and ministry from men who shared his struggles and witnessed his power firsthand. Their devotion to him reassured her that he was surrounded by people who would protect him when possible. The transformation was complete and irreversible. Her carpenter son had become Palestine's most recognized teacher and miracle worker. Mary watched from a distance as Jesus fulfilled the destiny that angels had announced before his birth. Yet with each passing day, she sensed they were moving toward some great crisis that would test everyone's faith to its very breaking point. The ministry continued its relentless pace, carrying Jesus further from the quiet life they had once shared and closer to a confrontation with powers that would not tolerate his challenge to their authority much longer. Mary could only watch and pray as events moved toward their inevitable climax. Moments of distance, the growing divide. Something changed between mother and son. The boy who once sat beside her spinning wool had become a man drawing thousands. Where Mary once knew his every thought, now Jesus spoke in riddles that left even his closest followers puzzled. The gentle child who helped Joseph in the workshop now overturned tables in the temple. Her heart ached with a loneliness she had never anticipated. The crowds pressed in everywhere Jesus went. Desperate hands reached toward him. Voices called his name from dawn until dusk. Mary watched from the edges, no longer the center of his world. She remembered when his biggest concern was whether the bread would rise properly. Now, entire kingdoms seemed to hang on his words. One afternoon, word came that Jesus was teaching nearby. Mary gathered her other sons and daughters, hoping for a quiet moment with her firstborn. They walked through dusty streets toward the house where he stayed. The building overflowed with people. Bodies filled every doorway. Voices spilled out into the courtyard. A messenger squeezed through the crowd toward Jesus. "Your mother and brothers are outside wanting to speak with you." Mary's heart lifted. Surely he would pause his teaching. Surely he would come as he always had. But Jesus looked up at the faces surrounding him, his expression distant and serene. "Who is my mother? Who are my brothers?" he asked the crowd. His voice carried clearly through the still air. "Whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother." The words struck Mary like stones. She felt her other children stiffen beside her. Heat rose in her cheeks. The crowd murmured their approval of Jesus' wisdom. But Mary stepped backward into the street, her chest tight, with something caught between hurt and understanding. She had carried him beneath her heart for 9 months. She had nursed him through fevers. She had watched him take his first steps in their small home in Nazareth. Yet now he spoke as if family bonds were nothing compared to spiritual ones. As if 30 years of love meant less than a single moment of faith. Walking home in silence, Mary's mind churned. She remembered the angel's words from so long ago. She recalled Simeon's prophecy about a sword piercing her soul. Perhaps this distance was part of the plan she had agreed to before she truly understood what it would cost. Jesus continued preaching throughout Galilee. Stories reached Mary of his growing boldness. He healed on the Sabbath, knowing it would anger the religious leaders. He ate with tax collectors and sinners, ignoring social customs. He spoke of himself in ways that made the Pharisees grind their teeth with rage. Mary worried about his safety. She worried about his growing separation from everything normal and human. Most of all, she worried about the look in his eyes when she saw him, a distance that seemed to stretch beyond the physical space between them. Sometimes Jesus would visit Nazareth, but even then he felt like a stranger. Neighbors whispered about his radical teachings. They remembered him as the carpenter's son who had played with their children. Now he spoke with an authority that made them uncomfortable. "Isn't this Mary's boy?" they asked each other. "Where did he get such wisdom? Who does he think he is?" Their skepticism wounded Mary more than she let on. She watched Jesus struggle with their rejection. "A prophet had no honor in his hometown," he said sadly. Even his own family found it difficult to grasp the magnitude of what was unfolding. Mary began to understand that loving Jesus meant letting him go completely. She had released him to God's will years before, but she had not expected that will to carry him so far from her reach. The mother in her wanted to protect him, to warn him about the dangers ahead. The believer in her recognized that he walked a path she could not follow. Late at night, Mary would lie awake remembering simpler times, Jesus as a toddler clinging to her robes. Jesus at 12, surprising the teachers with his questions. Jesus as a young man, strong and helpful, and still hers in all the ways that mattered. Now he belonged to the world. His love had expanded beyond what any single person could contain. Mary felt proud and bereft at the same time. She had raised the Messiah, but lost her son in the process. The distance between them was not cruelty. It was necessity. Jesus was becoming who he was always meant to be, and that person could not remain tied to earthly relationships in the old way. Mary sensed the sacrifice required of both of them. She would learn to love him differently, not as her child, but as her Lord. The road to Jerusalem. Clouds gather. Spring arrived in Galilee with wildflowers and fresh hope, but Mary felt winter settling in her bones. Something had shifted in Jesus' teachings. His parables grew darker, filled with warnings about judgment and separation. The hostility of the religious leaders sharpened like blades being carefully honed. Mary watched storm clouds gathering on every horizon. Jesus spoke more frequently about his death, not in whispers or private moments, but openly to his disciples. He told them he would suffer at the hands of the elders and chief priests. He said he would be killed and rise again on the third day. The apostles argued with him, refusing to believe such words. Mary believed every one of them. She had pondered too many mysteries in her heart to doubt him now. The angel's message from decades before had prepared her for this moment, though she had not fully understood it then. Her son would save his people, but the salvation would come through suffering. News moved quickly through the small villages around the Sea of Galilee. Mary heard reports of Jesus' growing boldness. He had raised Lazarus from the dead in Bethany, just outside Jerusalem. The miracle drew enormous crowds, but it also sealed his fate with the religious authorities. They could no longer ignore or dismiss him. The Pharisees and Sadducees began plotting in earnest. Mary learned of their schemes through whispered conversations in the marketplace. Some wanted Jesus arrested quietly, others preferred to discredit him publicly. All agreed he posed a threat to their power and position. Jesus seemed to court danger with purpose. He spoke more plainly about being the Son of God. He claimed the authority to forgive sins. He challenged the temple system that enriched the priests. Every word pushed his enemies closer to action. Mary watched from afar as Jesus' ministry intensified. Crowds followed him everywhere, but she noticed how many of his followers were poor, desperate, or considered outcasts. The powerful remained suspicious or hostile. This pattern troubled her maternal heart, even as it fulfilled ancient prophecies. The time of Passover approached, and Jesus made his intentions clear. He would go to Jerusalem for the feast. His disciples tried to dissuade him, fully aware of the dangers waiting in the holy city. But Jesus set his face toward Jerusalem like flint, determined to fulfill what had been written about him. Mary made her own preparations for the journey. She could not stay away knowing what awaited her son. Other mothers might have tried to prevent him from going. They might have pleaded or demanded he reconsider. But Mary had learned long ago that her role was not to obstruct God's plan, but to trust it entirely. The road from Galilee to Jerusalem filled with pilgrims during Passover season. Families traveled together singing psalms and sharing stories. Children darted between donkeys and camels. The atmosphere should have been joyful and festive. But Mary walked in the shadow of coming events. She saw Jesus ahead of her on the road, surrounded by his 12 disciples. They did not understand what waited for them in Jerusalem. Their conversations revealed hopes for earthly glory and political revolution. Jesus had tried to prepare them, but they could not yet grasp the full reality of his mission. As the walls of Jerusalem came into view, Mary's steps grew heavier. The city spread across its hills, magnificent and terrible in the afternoon light. The temple gleamed like gold, but Mary knew it would soon witness scenes of unimaginable sorrow. Jesus entered the city triumphantly, riding on a young donkey as crowds spread palm branches across his path. The people shouted, "Hosanna!" and "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." Their voices echoed off the stone walls with desperate hope. Mary watched the celebration with layered emotions. She rejoiced that her son received the honor due him. She felt proud that people recognized his worth and his mission. But she also knew how quickly crowds could change. The same voices shouting praise today might demand blood tomorrow. The religious leaders watched Jesus' triumphal entry with growing alarm. They had hoped his influence would fade, but instead it blazed brighter than ever. The common people clearly viewed him as their champion and deliverer. Something had to be done. and quickly. Mary found lodging near the temple, close enough to observe the unfolding drama. Jesus spent his days teaching in the temple courts, drawing large crowds with his wisdom and authority. But each evening brought fresh reports of new plots against him. The tension in Jerusalem was palpable. Pilgrims filled every street and courtyard. Roman soldiers patrolled more frequently, alert for any sign of unrest. The Jewish authorities moved carefully, knowing that the wrong action could ignite a riot during the holy season. Mary prayed without ceasing during those days. She prayed for strength to endure what was coming. She prayed for Jesus' disciples, who would soon face tests they could not imagine. Most of all, she prayed for her son, though she knew his path was already fixed. The clouds were gathering quickly now. Mary could feel the storm approaching with every breath she took. The Last Supper and the waiting mother. Darkness fell over Jerusalem like a heavy curtain. Mary sat in her small, borrowed room, listening to the sounds of Passover celebration echoing through the narrow streets. Families gathered around their tables, retelling the story of deliverance from Egypt. Children asked the traditional questions. Wine was poured, and bread was broken in remembrance. But Mary's heart carried a different weight that night. She knew Jesus was sharing his final meal with the 12 disciples somewhere in the city. She had not been invited to that gathering. The apostles would share this last sacred moment with her son, while she waited alone in the shadows. The exclusion did not surprise her. Jesus' ministry had grown beyond family bonds. His message belonged to the world now, not just to those who shared his blood. Still, the mother in her ached to be near him on this night of all nights. Earlier that day, Mary had caught sight of Jesus from a distance in the temple courts. He looked tired but resolute, like a man who had made peace with a difficult decision. His teachings had grown more urgent, more focused on eternal things. He spoke of love and sacrifice in ways that moved his listeners to tears. Mary had also noticed increased activity among the temple guards and religious leaders. They moved with purpose and barely concealed excitement. Whispered conversations ceased when she passed by. Eyes followed her with expressions that mixed pity and suspicion. She knew they were closing in on Jesus. The question was no longer if they would act, but when and how. The Passover crowds complicated their plans, but they would find a way. Power always found a way to eliminate what threatened it. As night deepened, Mary tried to picture what was happening at the upper room where Jesus gathered with his friends. She imagined him breaking bread with those calloused hands that had once been so small in hers. She wondered if he spoke about his childhood or whether he focused only on the mission ahead. The disciples would be confused by his words that night. Jesus often spoke in ways that only became clear later. They expected political victory and earthly glory. Instead, he would give them symbols of suffering and death. Bread broken like his body, wine poured out like his blood. Mary understood the symbolism better than any of them. She had carried the body that would be broken. She had felt the blood flowing through her own veins that would soon flow from his wounds. The physical reality of motherhood gave her an insight that even his closest followers lacked. A cool breeze stirred the curtains of her window. Mary pulled her shawl tighter and continued her vigil. She knew Jesus would pray in the garden after the meal. He often sought solitude with his Father during crucial moments. That night, his prayers would be more desperate than ever. She wondered if he was afraid. Jesus was fully human as well as fully divine. Surely the prospect of torture and death troubled his flesh, even if his spirit remained willing. Mary had seen him weep over Jerusalem's coming destruction. She had watched him grieve at Lazarus's tomb. He felt pain as deeply as any person. The thought of her son's fear broke something inside Mary's chest. Every maternal instinct screamed at her to run to him, to comfort him, as she had when he was small. But she forced herself to stay still. This was not her moment. This was between Jesus and his Father. Hours passed slowly. Mary dozed fitfully in her chair, startling awake at every sound from the street. Jerusalem never truly slept during Passover, but tonight felt different. The very air felt charged with expectation and dread. Near midnight, Mary heard shouting in the distance. Torches flickered through her window as groups of men moved through the streets. The sounds grew closer, then faded again. She pressed her face against the cool stone wall, straining to understand what was happening. Then she knew. They had arrested him. Somewhere in the darkness, temple guards were binding Jesus' hands and leading him away. The final act of the drama had begun. There would be no more waiting, no more uncertainty. The sword that Simeon had prophesied would now pierce her soul completely. Mary sank to her knees on the hard floor. She had prayed for this moment never to come, even knowing it must. She had hoped somehow that God would provide another way, even as the scriptures made the path unmistakably clear. Now hope and denial fell away, leaving only the terrible reality of love's ultimate test. Her son was in the hands of his enemies. By morning, the world would see what mankind did to perfect love when it walked among them. Mary wept quietly in the darkness, not for herself, but for a world about to make the greatest mistake in history. The night stretched endlessly ahead. There would be no sleep now, only prayer, only trust, only the long darkness before dawn. The trial. A mother's silent witness. Dawn broke grey and cold over Jerusalem. Mary had not slept. She had sat by her window through the darkest hours, praying and listening to the distant sounds of commotion. Now, in pale early light, crowds were already gathering in the streets. Word of Jesus' arrest had spread quickly through the city. Mary wrapped her cloak around her shoulders and stepped into the morning air. She needed to find her son. Maternal instinct pulled her forward despite the danger. She would not let Jesus face this alone, even if she could only watch from the shadows. The streets hummed with tension and excitement. Pilgrims who had come for Passover now found themselves witnesses to something unprecedented. Many had heard Jesus teach in the temple courts just days before. They whispered among themselves, trying to make sense of what was unfolding. Mary moved through the crowds like a ghost. Her heart beat so hard she thought others must surely hear it. Every face she passed seemed to carry knowledge of her shame, that she was the mother of the arrested troublemaker. But most people were too absorbed in their own concerns to notice one more grieving woman. She followed the flow of people toward the fortress where Pilate held court. The Roman governor would hear Jesus' case, since the Jewish authorities lacked the power to carry out an execution. Mary's legs felt weak as she climbed the stone steps, but she forced herself forward. The courtyard filled rapidly with onlookers. Mary pressed herself against a wall, trying to remain invisible. She could see the judgment seat, where Pilate would soon appear. Guards stood at attention around the platform. Everything had been arranged for the morning's deadly proceedings. Then she saw him. Jesus stood between two soldiers, his hands bound with rope. His face was swollen from the night's beatings. Blood had dried in his hair and beard, but his eyes remained clear and calm, as though he were attending someone else's trial. Mary's knees nearly gave way. All her maternal strength abandoned her in that moment. This was her baby, her little boy, who had once laughed at her silly songs. Now he stood bruised and bleeding before hostile judges, facing death for telling the truth about God's love. She wanted to cry out, to push through the crowd and pull him into her arms. She wanted to tend his wounds and smooth his matted hair. She wanted to carry him home to Nazareth, where he would be safe. But she could only stand in helpless silence as events unfolded according to God's terrible plan. Pilate emerged from his chambers looking annoyed and tired. He clearly had no desire to deal with Jewish religious disputes so early in the morning. The crowd stirred with anticipation as he settled into the judgment seat. The accusations began immediately. The chief priests and elders had prepared their case with care. They charged Jesus with claiming to be a king, with stirring up rebellion, with threatening the temple. They spoke with passionate conviction, as if they truly believed their own words. Mary listened to their lies with growing horror. These men had heard Jesus teach about love and forgiveness. They knew his message was spiritual, not political. yet they twisted his words into weapons against him. Truth meant nothing when power felt threatened. Pilate questioned Jesus with obvious reluctance. The Roman governor was experienced enough to recognize innocence when he encountered it. Jesus answered some questions and stayed silent for others. His dignity in the face of false accusations was heartbreaking and magnificent. Mary watched her son's composure with a mixture of amazement and grief. Even now, even facing death, Jesus showed no anger toward his accusers. He looked at them with something that approached pity. This was the man they were determined to destroy, someone whose only crime was loving too completely. The crowd grew restless as Pilate hesitated. He clearly wanted to release Jesus, but feared the political cost. The Jewish leaders sensed his uncertainty and pressed their advantage. They threatened to report him to Caesar if he freed someone who claimed to be a king. Mary saw the moment when Pilate's resolve collapsed. Fear of losing his position overcame any desire for justice. He called for water and made a show of washing his hands, declaring himself free of Jesus' blood. The gesture convinced no one, least of all himself. "Crucify him!" The crowd's chant bounced off the stone walls. Mary felt each repetition like a physical blow. These were the same people who had welcomed Jesus into the city with palm branches just days before. Now they called for his blood with equal enthusiasm. Jesus stood motionless through it all. His eyes moved across the crowd briefly, and for one terrifying moment Mary thought he had seen her. But his gaze continued on without pausing. Perhaps it was better that way. She could carry her own grief, but not the added weight of his sorrow at witnessing her pain. The sentence was delivered with brutal efficiency. Jesus would be crucified that morning alongside two common criminals. The crowd cheered as if a competition had been decided in their favor. Guards began preparing for the procession to Golgotha. Mary pressed her back against the cold stone wall, feeling as if the world itself were ending. In a sense, it was. Perfect love was about to be murdered by the very people it had come to rescue. The completeness of the irony took her breath away. As they led Jesus away, Mary finally stepped out from her hiding place. She would follow him to the end, whatever that cost her. She was his mother. This was her place, her calling, her unbearable privilege. The mother's vigil was only beginning. The road to Golgotha, the cross in her eyes. The morning sun rises cold over Jerusalem. Mary walks through streets she has known since childhood, yet everything feels different now. Her son moves ahead, stumbling beneath the weight of rough-hewn wood. The crowd presses in around them, some jeering, others weeping. She follows at a distance, each step heavier than the last. The wooden beam scrapes against stone. Jesus falls. Mary's heart lurches forward, but soldiers push her back. A mother's instinct battles against helplessness. She can only watch as strangers help him rise. The procession moves like a funeral march through the city gates. Mary sees familiar faces in the crowd. Women who once brought their children to hear Jesus teach. Now they look away, afraid to be recognized. Fear has replaced wonder in their eyes. Simon of Cyrene takes up the cross. Mary feels a brief surge of gratitude toward this stranger who shows mercy when everyone else shows cruelty. The weight lifts from her son's shoulders, but not from her heart. She knows where this path leads. The hill called Golgotha rises ahead. Its name means place of the skull. How fitting, Mary thinks. Death rules here. The ground beneath her feet has absorbed the blood of countless condemned men. Now it waits for more. She remembers other walks they took together, little feet beside hers on dusty roads around Nazareth, his hand in hers as they climbed hills to pick olives. Those same feet now leave bloody prints on stone. Those same hands will soon be pierced. The crowd thickens near the execution site. Some push forward for a better view, others hold back, covering their children's eyes. Mary moves forward anyway. She will not abandon him now. A mother belongs with her child, no matter what comes. Roman soldiers busy themselves with their grim work. They strip Jesus of his clothes. Mary turns away for a moment, then forces herself to look. She will witness every moment. She will hold every detail in her memory. Someone must carry this story forward. The cross lies flat on the ground. Jesus is pressed down upon it. Mary hears the first hammer blow. The sound echoes off the stone walls and drives straight through her. She doubles forward as if struck herself. The nail finds its mark. Another blow falls. Each strike reverberates through her bones. This is her baby's flesh being torn. These are the hands that once reached for her in the night when nightmares came. Now they reach toward heaven as metal tears through them. The second hand is secured, then his feet. Mary watches her son become a thing to be lifted and displayed. The cross rises with ropes and shouting. It drops into its hole with a thud that shakes the earth. Jesus hangs suspended between heaven and earth. The crowd settles in to wait. Some gamble for his clothes, others mock and sneer, a few weep quietly. Mary finds herself among the mourners, the faithful few who refuse to leave. She plants herself at the foot of the cross like a tree with deep roots. Hours pass slowly. The sun climbs higher. Jesus speaks little, each word costing him greatly. Mary listens to every whisper, holds every glance. Their eyes find each other across the space between earth and cross. In that look passes a lifetime of love, sorrow, and understanding. She remembers his birth in Bethlehem's stable. She held him close against the cold night air. Now she cannot hold him, cannot comfort him, cannot take his place. The distance between them feels infinite, though she stands just below. The sky begins to darken, though noon has already passed. An unnatural twilight settles over Jerusalem. Even the earth seems to grieve. The very air grows heavy with sorrow. Mary pulls her cloak tighter, but the cold comes from somewhere inside her. At the foot of the cross, unspeakable pain. Darkness covers the land like a burial shroud. Mary stands rooted to this cursed ground, her eyes fixed upward where her son hangs dying. Time moves differently here. Minutes stretch into hours. Hours compress into heartbeats. She is not alone, but she might as well be. John stands beside her, young and visibly shaken. Mary Magdalene weeps without restraint. A few other women huddle together against the horror. Yet Mary feels completely isolated in her grief. No one else carried him for 9 months. No one else taught him to walk. The soldiers continue their work around the crosses. 3 men hang here today. 2 thieves bracket her son. One mocks him even now. The other defends him. Mary marvels that Jesus can inspire loyalty even in his darkest hour. Even thieves can see something divine in him. Her son's breathing grows labored. Each breath costs him dearly. Mary finds herself breathing with him, willing her lungs somehow to help his. If she could take this suffering upon herself, she would do it without hesitation. But grace rarely works that way. Woman, behold your son. Jesus speaks through cracked lips, nodding toward John. Behold your mother. He places her in the young apostle's care. Even in agony, he thinks of others. Even while dying, he provides for those he loves. Mary understands. She gains a son in John. John gains a mother in her. But no one can replace the one she loses today. No substitute exists for this particular love, this unique bond forged in her womb and sealed through 30 years of shared life. The crowd grows restless as the afternoon wears on. Some drift away, their appetite for spectacle satisfied. Others remain, sensing they are witnessing something without precedent. The darkness deepens. Strange things begin to happen when God dies on a cross. Jesus cries out in a loud voice. The words echo off stone and bone. My God, why have you forsaken me?" Mary recognizes the psalm. Even now, he speaks scripture. Even in abandonment, he clings to ancient promises. The faithful words of David become his own. But Mary hears more than scripture in that cry. She hears the child who woke from nightmares calling out for her. She hears the boy who scraped his knee running to her for comfort. She hears her son asking questions she cannot answer. Why must this happen? Why can't she fix it? The earth trembles beneath their feet. Rocks split open. The veil in the temple tears from top to bottom. Creation itself responds to this moment. Even stones find more voice than Mary does now. Grief has taken her words. I thirst. The simple words carry oceans of meaning. Mary remembers nursing him as a baby. She remembers countless cups of water shared at their table. She remembers drawing from Jacob's well while he rested nearby. Now she cannot give him even a single sip. A soldier soaks a sponge in sour wine and lifts it on a stick. Jesus tastes it briefly. Mary watches this small mercy with gratitude, thankful for any kindness offered here. She has learned to value the smallest human decencies in this place of horror. The sky grows darker still. An unnatural night falls at midday. Even the sun seems to turn away rather than watch this scene. Mary understands. Some sights are too terrible for light to hold. Some moments require darkness to contain them. It is finished. 3 words that change everything. Jesus speaks them clearly, with complete conviction. His work is done. His mission accomplished. Mary hears triumph woven into his voice. Even as her heart shatters, he has done what he came to do. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. The final words arrive as a whisper that somehow carries across the entire hilltop. Jesus bows his head forward. His chest stops rising. His eyes close. Mary's world ends. The silence that follows is absolute. Even the mockers fall quiet. The soldiers stop their gambling. The wind ceases. The very air holds its breath. Death has won the day, or so it appears. Mary stares at the still form that once danced inside her womb. John's arm comes around her shoulders. She leans into him without thinking. Her legs feel unsteady. Her vision blurs with tears. The young man leads her away from the cross. She goes because she must, but part of her remains forever at the foot of that tree. The burial and the longest silence. Evening approaches with heavy steps. The Sabbath draws near, bringing its own urgency to this day of death. Jewish law requires bodies to be removed before sunset. Mary watches from a distance as men of standing approach the cross where her son hangs. Joseph of Arimathea arrives with official papers. A secret follower of Jesus, he has found courage at last. Wealth and position open doors that grief alone cannot. He requests the body from Pilate. The governor grants permission with surprising speed. Nicodemus comes as well, the Pharisee who once visited Jesus under cover of night. He brings spices, myrrh and aloes mixed together, nearly 100 pounds worth. Such costly burial preparations speak of deep respect. Even those who kept their devotion hidden recognize that something extraordinary has died today. The ladder leans against the cross. Strong hands work carefully to remove the nails. Mary turns away as metal pulls free from flesh. Some sights, even a mother cannot bear a second time. The sound of his body being received into waiting arms reaches her ears. They wrap him in clean linen cloths with the aromatic spices layered between them. Ancient customs guide their hands. Death has its rituals, its proper procedures. Mary has performed these rites before for her own parents, but never for her child. The natural order lies shattered on the ground. A tomb waits nearby, carved fresh from rock. Joseph had prepared it for himself, but offers it now for Jesus. The heavy stone fits perfectly into its groove. Mary watches them roll it shut with a sound like distant thunder. Her son disappears behind limestone and darkness. The women who had followed Jesus gather around Mary. They plan to return after the Sabbath with additional spices. There was no time for proper preparation today. They will honor him correctly once the law allows it. Mary nods, but says nothing. Words feel useless now. John leads her away to his home in the city. The streets seem unaware that anything has changed. People buy bread, tend to their children, prepare for evening meals. Life continues as if the world has not shifted beneath itself, as if God has not died and been buried. The Sabbath begins at sunset. Candles are lit in windows across Jerusalem. Families gather for their traditional meals. Prayers rise from countless homes. But in John's house, silence holds the air. Mary sits without moving, without speaking, without eating. Grief has no appetite. Sleep brings no relief. Mary lies awake, staring at the ceiling beams. Every time she closes her eyes, she sees the cross. Every breath she draws reminds her that he no longer breathes. The night stretches endlessly forward. Dawn feels impossible. Saturday arrives grey and cold. The Sabbath commandment forbids work. But what work could Mary do anyway? Her hands lie still in her lap. Her mind circles without rest, like a bird trapped inside a cage. The law's rest feels less like a blessing and more like a cage of its own. John tries to coax her to eat. The other women bring food and comfort. Mary receives their care without truly taking it in. She exists inside a sphere of sorrow that nothing can penetrate. Even warmth finds no entry, sliding off her like water off rock. The day moves with unbearable slowness. Every hour feels like a decade. Mary tracks the minutes since his last breath left his body. She calculates how many hours have passed since the tomb was sealed shut. Time becomes her adversary, stretching every moment of anguish into something that feels like forever. Memory rushes in to fill the silence around her. She remembers the first cry he made as a newborn baby, his first unsteady steps across the floor of their home in Nazareth. His first spoken words, "Mama," shaped by infant lips. The boy who worked alongside Joseph in the carpenter's workshop. The young man who sat and studied Torah alongside the elders. She recalls the moments of quiet pride when others spoke highly of his wisdom. When entire crowds hung on his every word, when people who were sick walked away completely healed. She remembers the moments of deep worry, when he stayed behind in the temple without telling anyone. When he left home to begin preaching, when enemies first started plotting against him. Now every one of those memories feels like borrowed time. 33 years that moved far too quickly, a whole lifetime compressed into decades that feel no longer than a breath. Mary would give up anything she has for one more conversation, one more embrace, one more chance to say a proper goodbye. The sun goes down on Saturday. Another full day ends without him. Mary faces the brutal mathematics of grief. Each sunset carries her further from the last moment they shared. Each sunrise begins another day he will not be present to see. Time becomes distance, and distance becomes a different kind of pain. Night returns again, the second night since the cross. Mary lies in the dark and wonders what is supposed to come next. How does a mother learn to go on living without the child who first made her a mother? How does life carry forward when the very center of it has been torn out? The women speak in hushed voices about what they will do tomorrow. They will go to the tomb at the first light of morning. They will finish the burial preparations that Friday's terrible urgency had prevented. They will give him proper honor with the right spices and careful, loving attention. Mary listens to their planning, but cannot picture tomorrow. This Saturday stretches like a vast, empty field between death and whatever might follow. It feels like the longest single day in all of human history. Even God seems to have gone somewhere else, hidden away behind the stone that seals the tomb shut. The world holds its breath and simply waits, though no one can say with certainty what the waiting is for. The resurrection, a mother's quiet joy. Sunday morning comes before the city stirs from sleep. Mary rises before the sun appears, moving quietly through the rooms of John's home. The women gather in soft, whispered conversations, getting the spices ready and laying out the burial cloths. Someone has to finish what Friday left incomplete. Mary Magdalene leads the small group of them through streets that are still empty and silent. Their footsteps bounce off the stone walls around them. The city sleeps on, with no idea that this particular day is about to change absolutely everything. Even the guards, stationed at the various gates, seem half asleep, waving the women through without really looking at them. The garden tomb rests just outside the city walls. Olive trees cast their long shadows in the pale light before dawn. Birds have already begun their morning songs by the time the women reach the burial site. Everything looks exactly as it should until they come around the final bend in the path. The stone has been rolled away. The massive boulder that sealed the entrance to the tomb sits off to one side, as though moved by hands far larger than any human pair. The opening gapes dark and empty before them. The women stop where they stand, unsure what this means or what they ought to do. Mary Magdalene moves forward first. She leans in to look into the darkness, then stumbles backward with a sharp, audible gasp. The tomb is empty. Clean burial cloths lie folded with care in the very place where a body should be resting. The mourning they had carefully planned has taken a turn that makes no earthly sense. Someone has taken him. Mary Magdalene breathes out. Fresh grief tangles with confusion. Grave robbing was not unheard of in those times, but why would anyone steal a body and leave expensive burial spices behind without touching them? Why fold the cloth so deliberately and carefully? Why leave behind no sign of struggle, no evidence of haste? The women separate to carry the news in different directions. Some run to find Peter and John. Others hurry back into Jerusalem to tell the larger group of followers what they have found. Mary finds herself standing alone in the garden, in front of the empty tomb, with questions that have no answers available to her on this earth. She steps inside the limestone chamber. Morning light filters through the opening, falling softly on the empty shelf where Jesus had been laid. The burial cloths remain, undisturbed. No marks of violence appear anywhere on the walls. This looks far less like theft than like something else entirely, something that has no name. Two figures dressed in white sit where the head and feet of Jesus had rested. Angels, though Mary only comes to understand them as such gradually. Their presence feels natural in this place where the ordinary rules of the world seem to have been suspended. They speak to her gently, without urgency or alarm. Why do you seek the living among the dead? The question lingers in the cool air of the tomb. Mary turns it over in her mind. Why indeed would life be found inside a tomb, and yet where else is she supposed to look for him? Death had seemed so completely final just the day before. The angels remind her of the words Jesus himself had spoken. He told them this was going to happen. That death would not be able to hold him. 3 days, he had said. Mary counts back from Friday. Today is exactly the 3rd day. Could he have meant those words literally, in the plainest possible sense? She turns to leave the tomb and nearly walks directly into a man standing in the garden outside. The gardener, she assumes. He speaks to her with kindness, asking her who it is she is looking for. Mary explains about the missing body, the empty tomb, the bewildering strangeness of this morning. Mary, her name, spoken in a voice she knows the way she knows her own heartbeat, stops her completely. She turns fully to face the man and finds not a gardener at all, but her son, alive, standing upright, speaking to her. The word impossible dissolves on her lips as joy fills her chest from the inside out. She reaches out toward him, and he steps back gently. "Do not cling to me," he says, with a tenderness that carries firmness inside it. "I have not yet ascended to the Father. The resurrection body is somehow different, the same and yet changed. Present, but in a way that is clearly transitional." Mary understands without being able to explain her understanding. This is her son, and also something beyond her son. The man who died on Friday has become something entirely new. Death could not contain him. The grave could not hold him. Life has claimed the ultimate victory. She wants to hold him, to touch his face, to confirm with her hands that this is real, but his words create a necessary and holy distance. This reunion is a temporary one. He has work left to do, places to be, a mission to carry through to its completion. Even resurrection operates on heaven's own schedule. Go and tell the others, he instructs her. Mary nods, even though leaving feels like an impossibility. How do you simply turn and walk away from a miracle? How do you step back from the presence of the impossible made real before your eyes? Yet, obedience has always been the shape of her relationship with God. She runs back toward the city, her heart lighter than it has been in months. The grief that had been crushing her spirit lifts away like mist burning off in the morning sun. Death has been defeated. Her son is alive. The tomb stands empty, not because of theft, but because of triumph. The other women see her joy before she speaks a single word. Something in her face, in the way she moves, in her very presence announces what should be impossible news. He is risen, she tells them simply. 3 words that restore the world to its proper order. Not everyone believes right away. Such news sounds too extraordinary to be true. Death rarely cancels its verdicts. Graves rarely surrender what has been committed to them. Yet Mary speaks with such quiet, steady certainty that doubt begins to give way. Peter and John run to see the evidence for themselves. They find the tomb exactly as Mary had described it. Empty, clean, peaceful, the burial cloths folded with a care no thief would ever think to show. Evidence of something that lies entirely beyond their capacity to understand. Mary returns to John's house. Her steps fall lightly on the stone streets. The city is beginning to wake up around her. Merchants arrange their goods, children play in doorways. Life goes on, completely unaware that life itself has won its greatest victory this morning. She sits quietly in the sunshine, letting herself absorb what she has seen and heard. Her son is alive. Death could not hold him. The grave could not claim him. Joy replaces the sorrow that had hollowed her out. Hope conquers the despair that had moved in to fill the space. Sunday morning has changed everything. The aftermath. Life without her son. Days blend into weeks as the news of the resurrection spreads throughout Jerusalem and then outward beyond it. Mary finds herself at the center of a community that has been completely remade by what should have been impossible. Grief has made way for joy, but the adjustment brings its own particular difficulties. The other followers gather every day to share meals together, to pray, and to try to make sense of what has happened among them. Peter speaks with an authority he never had before. John carries a deeper wisdom in his eyes. Thomas has moved from stubborn doubt into firm faith. Everyone seems to carry the mark of these recent events on them. Mary watches this transformation unfold with wonder. These are the same people who scattered in panic on Friday night. The same disciples who spent Saturday hiding behind locked doors. Now they speak openly and boldly about resurrection and life that does not end. The fear has been replaced by something burning and alive. Jesus appears among them at unexpected moments throughout the days that follow. Sometimes during shared meals, sometimes in rooms whose doors are locked, sometimes along familiar roads. Each appearance builds their faith and deepens what they understand. Death has become a doorway rather than a destination they should dread. And yet Mary carries a peculiar loneliness inside all of this joy. Her relationship with Jesus must change now. He is no longer simply her son, but the risen Lord of all creation. The intimate bond between mother and child transforms into something that is more universal in its reach and less personally hers to hold. She shares him now with the whole world in a way she never could have imagined before. Every person whose life is touched by his story becomes part of his family. Every follower has a claim on his attention. Mary must learn to release her unique position as his mother. The adjustment is genuinely hard. 33 years of being his closest human relationship cannot simply be set aside. She remembers nursing him through the illnesses of childhood. She remembers mending his clothes and preparing his food. Those days feel like they belong to another lifetime entirely. Now he appears and disappears according to schedules arranged in heaven. He speaks of returning to the Father. He prepares his followers to live with his absence rather than his presence. Even resurrection comes with the promise of an eventual departure. Mary finds comfort in the community of believers that is forming around her. The women who stood beside her at the cross become sisters in this new kind of family. The disciples who once competed with each other for Jesus' attention now compete to serve one another instead. Love multiplies rather than divides itself. She helps prepare meals for the growing group of people. Her hands find their familiar comfort in the work of the household. Feeding people, cleaning spaces, mending what is torn. These simple acts of service give her steadiness in a world turned completely upside down by miracle. The stories begin to take shape as the weeks go by. Matthew writes down the teachings of Jesus. Mark sets down Peter's memories. Luke interviews the witnesses and puts together careful accounts of what occurred. John reflects at length and with great depth on what these events mean in the largest theological sense. Mary contributes her own recollections to the work. She tells them about the Annunciation, about the angel's words, about the fear she felt and the acceptance that followed it. She describes the journey to Bethlehem, the birth in the stable, the visit from the shepherds who came in from the fields. Her memories become treasures she offers to the community as gifts. The wedding at Cana takes on fresh significance when they discuss it together. Mary's role in prompting Jesus' first miracle becomes a pattern for understanding intercessory prayer. Her simple instruction to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you," becomes guidance offered to all believers. They ask her about his childhood, his growth from a baby into a young man, how his understanding developed over time. Mary shares what she is able to, while protecting what should remain between a mother and her child. Some memories belong to mothers alone. Some moments are too sacred for public sharing. The community grows every single day as word continues spreading through the city. Priests and Pharisees, who had opposed Jesus, come now seeking truth. Roman soldiers ask questions about this man who apparently conquered death itself. Even Gentiles begin expressing genuine interest in the story of the resurrection. Mary watches this expansion with a sense of amazement. Her son's reach extends far beyond anything she could have envisioned. The baby born in a stable in Bethlehem has become the cornerstone of something that is growing into a worldwide movement. God's plan proves larger than any human imagination could ever hold. And yet she misses the plain, unadorned intimacy of their early years. She would trade all of this cosmic significance for one quiet evening at home in Nazareth. She would exchange worldwide renown for a single ordinary conversation over supper. Motherhood wants what motherhood has always wanted: more time. Jesus appears to them one final time on a mountain outside Jerusalem. He speaks about going ahead of them to prepare a place. He promises to come back someday. He gives them the Holy Spirit as their comfort and guide in his absence. Then he ascends into heaven as they stand watching. Mary stands among the disciples, her face turned upward long after he has disappeared from their sight. This departure feels entirely different from death. This separation carries promise inside it rather than finality. And yet the ache in her chest is real and sharp. Angels appear to remind them that he will return the same way he has gone. The promise gives them hope, but it does not provide immediate relief from the pain. Mary must learn to live with an absence that is made bearable only by the certainty of a future reunion. Faith must fill the space left behind by physical presence. They walk back to Jerusalem with worship in their hearts and unanswered questions on their minds. What comes next? How do they continue without his visible leadership guiding each step? How do they carry this message to the ends of the earth as he has commanded? The answers will come, but not all at once and not all at the same time. The upper room. The Spirit descends. 10 days pass from the time Jesus ascended and disappeared from their sight. The disciples gather every day in the upper room where they had shared their final meal with him. Prayer fills the hours from dawn to dusk. Waiting becomes their primary occupation, the one task given to them for now. Mary joins them faithfully every day, her presence bringing a kind of comfort to the uncertain group around her. She, who waited 9 months for his birth, now waits again for whatever God intends to do next. Patience has become her spiritual discipline, sharpened and refined through these days of sustained practice. 120 believers crowd into the room and the spaces that adjoin it. Men and women, old and young, Jewish people from many different regions and backgrounds. A kind of unity rises out of their diversity as they fix their attention on a common hope and on their shared experience of the risen Christ. They pray in turns, keeping up constant communication with heaven throughout the day. Some recite the familiar psalms, others speak words that arise spontaneously from their own hearts. In the moment, silence moves in between the vocal prayers. The room carries a hum of spiritual energy even during its quietest minutes. Mary often finds herself returning in memory to the Annunciation. The angel's words play again in her mind. Nothing is impossible with God. She had believed those words when every circumstance made them seem absurd. She believes them now as they wait together for another impossible intervention from above. The festival of Pentecost arrives, bringing its familiar rhythms with it. Jerusalem fills up with pilgrims who have come from every corner of the known world. Jewish communities from every nation send their representatives to celebrate the harvest festival and to remember how the law was given at Sinai. Morning prayers begin, as usual, in their upper room. Those gathered there lift their voices together in thanksgiving and petition. Mary's voice rises with the others, her prayers joining the rest like incense curling upward toward heaven. Then something extraordinary begins. Wind fills the room, though no windows are standing open. Not a gentle, soft breeze, but a rushing, mighty sound that seems to come from every direction at the same moment. The very air begins moving with a force that cannot be explained by anything natural. Every single person in the room feels it, hears it, experiences it all at once. Tongues of fire appear, hovering above each person's head. Not flames that burn the skin, but light that illuminates the one it rests upon. Each tongue dances on its own while remaining part of a single greater blaze. The room fills with a light that casts no shadows and produces no heat. Mary feels the fire settle upon her like a crown being placed gently on her head. Warmth moves through her entire body, from the top of her head to the soles of her feet. Her mind sharpens with a sudden, clear understanding. Her heart overflows with a joy that has no adequate description. The Holy Spirit has arrived exactly as Jesus promised. And then she begins to speak, but not in Aramaic or Hebrew. Words flow from her lips in languages she has never once been taught. The same thing happens throughout the entire room. Everyone speaks, but everyone speaks differently, each voice forming words in tongues entirely unknown to them before this hour. The sound draws crowds up from the street below. Pilgrims gathered in the city for the festival hear the commotion and make their way toward its source. What they find when they arrive makes no sense to them at all. Galilean fishermen and women speaking with complete fluency in languages from all across the world. How can this possibly be? They ask one another in bewilderment. These people are from Galilee, and yet each of us is hearing them speak in our own native language. Parthians and Medes and Elamites and people from Mesopotamia all hear the wonders of God being proclaimed in their mother tongues. Some are astonished at what they are witnessing. Others mock what they see and suggest the believers must have been drinking. Peter rises to address the crowd, his voice carrying a new authority and power he did not have before. The Holy Spirit transforms fishermen into preachers and mothers into missionaries in a single morning. Mary listens as Peter explains to the crowd what has happened. He speaks the words of the prophet Joel about God pouring out his Spirit on all people. Sons and daughters will prophesy, old men will receive dreams, young men will see visions. Even servants will be given the Spirit's power. The gift covers her as completely as it covers the men around her. Gender creates no barrier to the Spirit's work. Age presents no obstacle to divine empowerment. Mary receives the same baptism of fire that falls on Peter and John and all the rest. She thinks of Hannah's ancient song from centuries before, when the barren woman conceived Samuel against all odds. She recalls her own Magnificat, sung in Elizabeth's home when both of them were carrying miraculous children. Now she is part of another song, this one being sung in the languages of the whole world. 3,000 people respond to Peter's sermon that day. Baptisms continue from morning until the evening light fades. The community that had numbered 120 people multiplies beyond any easy counting. The church bursts into existence with supernatural power and force. Mary watches the baptisms with tears of joy moving down her face. Each person who disappears beneath the water and rises again reminds her of her son's death and his resurrection. His victory becomes their victory. His new life becomes their new life. The upper room can no longer contain the community that is growing by the hour. People spill out into homes throughout the city. Daily gatherings become multiple gatherings in different places. What began as a small group of disciples becomes a movement that transforms the entire city. Mary finds her role changing once again. No longer simply the mother of Jesus, she becomes something like a mother to the church itself. Her presence soothes new believers who are finding their way. Her memories of Jesus give the community a foundation for their faith. Her prayers cover them like a protective covering. The Holy Spirit continues working through her just as through all the other believers. She prays for people who are sick and sees them healed. She speaks prophetic words that give the community what it needs to go on. She teaches younger women about faith, obedience, and what it means to trust God's impossible promises. Evening falls on this day of wonders. The city buzzes with excitement and confusion in equal measure. Religious leaders huddle to plan their response to this unexpected development. Roman authorities consider what these large gatherings might mean politically. But in homes throughout Jerusalem, new believers are praying with a joy they cannot fully explain. Mary returns to John's house, her heart full beyond what words can carry, and her mind still reeling from what has occurred. The promise has been kept. The Helper has come. The Spirit of her Son now lives inside her and inside thousands of others. The church has been born in power and fire. Mary's final years, the mother of the movement. Years pass like a gentle stream, moving steadily forward. Mary grows old gracefully inside John's home, her face carrying the marks of both deep sorrow and deep joy. The church continues spreading throughout Jerusalem and into lands beyond it. Her role shifts from active participant to honored elder, who has seen everything from the beginning. Young believers seek her out specifically for stories about Jesus. They want to hear about his childhood, about the years of his growing up, about his daily habits and the private thoughts he shared with those closest to him. Mary shares with care, protecting certain memories while offering others as gifts that will strengthen the faith of those who receive them. She tells them about his laughter, about the compassion he showed toward animals, about his skill with tools in Joseph's workshop. She describes his love for Scripture, his searching questions about divine mysteries, and the way his understanding of his unique calling grew gradually over time. These deeply human details make his divine nature feel more approachable to those who only know him through stories. The apostles travel further from Jerusalem as time goes on. Peter makes his way to Rome. Paul journeys throughout the Mediterranean world. Thomas reportedly travels all the way to India. The message spreads like seeds released on the wind, taking root in distant and unexpected soil. Mary receives visitors from time to time, bringing her news from these faraway places. Churches have been established in Syria, in Asia Minor, in Greece, and beyond. Her son's name is being praised in languages she has never spoken, by people she will never be able to embrace on this earth. Sometimes the reports bring worry with them. False teachers distort the message. Persecution. breaks out in various cities. Believers face imprisonment, exile, and even death for holding to their faith. Mary prays every day for these scattered ones, these spiritual children she will never meet in person. Her prayer life deepens as her body ages. Long hours of quiet communion with God replace the more active service of her earlier years. She intercedes for the universal church, for specific communities she has heard about, for individual believers who are facing trials. John remains her faithful companion and protector through all of it. He has grown from the young man who stood beside her at the cross into a mature and trusted leader of the Jerusalem church. The care he gives her reflects the dying words of Jesus, "Behold your mother." They speak often of the early days together, comparing what each remembers of events they both witnessed. John's perspective as a disciple fits together with her view as a mother. Together, they hold a complete picture of Jesus' earthly ministry from its very beginning to its end. Other women from those early days come to visit regularly. Mary Magdalene brings stories from her travels. Martha and Mary from Bethany carry news from their village. The women who had followed Jesus maintain the bonds formed in their shared devotion to him, bonds that distance cannot break. Physical limitations begin slowly restricting what Mary can do. Walking becomes difficult. Her voice grows softer with the years. Her energy diminishes as the seasons continue to pass. And yet her spirit stays vibrant. Her faith does not waver. Her love for God's people remains steady and constant. She experiences visions from time to time, glimpses of heavenly realities that strengthen the hope she carries. She sees Jesus in his glory, making ready the places he promised for his followers. She sees the great multitude that no one could ever count, people from every nation worshipping together as one. Letters arrive from various churches, some of them addressed specifically to her. Believers across the known world consider her their spiritual mother. They ask for her prayers, her blessing, her remembrance of them before God. Her influence reaches well beyond the walls of Jerusalem. Mary dictates responses when she has the strength to do so. She blesses the churches, encourages faithfulness in them, and promises to keep praying for them. Her words carry a particular weight because of her unique relationship with Jesus. Everyone who receives them knows she speaks from intimate knowledge no one else possesses. Local believers gather at her bedside during her final illness. They pray for healing, but also for the grace to accept whatever God wills. Mary shows no fear of what is coming, only a quiet and certain anticipation of reunion with her son, with Joseph, with Elizabeth and Zechariah, with all who have gone on ahead of her. She speaks of seeing Jesus again, of having questions finally answered, of understanding mysteries that this life keeps hidden from view. Death appears to her not as an enemy to be feared, but as a doorway through which she is about to pass, not as an ending, but as the beginning of something far better. Her breathing becomes labored. John holds one of her hands, while Mary Magdalene holds the other. The room is filled with quiet prayers and gentle songs. Mary's lips move without sound, perhaps in prayer, perhaps in conversation with visitors from another place entirely. As the evening shadows stretch across the room, Mary's breathing slows and finally becomes still. Her face remains at peace, something almost like a smile resting on it. Those present sense that her spirit has simply moved from one room into another, from this temporary dwelling on earth into heaven's home that will not end. John closes her eyes and folds her hands across her chest. The mother of Jesus rests as though in peaceful sleep. Her long journey of faith has come to its earthly conclusion, but her story will continue in the church she helped to bring into being and to nurture with everything she had. The Assumption. The mystery of her departure. News of Mary's passing moves quickly through Jerusalem's Christian community. Believers gather to honor the woman who gave birth to their Savior, who stood by him through every moment of his ministry and his crucifixion, who witnessed his resurrection and received the Holy Spirit alongside the rest. The preparations for burial follow Jewish customs shaped by Christian hope. Her body is washed and anointed with precious spices. Clean linen wrappings replace the simple clothing she wore. Prayers mix with tears as the community says their farewell to the woman who was their spiritual mother. And yet something unusual takes place during these familiar rituals. Those who attend to Mary's body notice something remarkable about its condition. No signs of decay touch her features. Her skin remains soft and warm to the touch. Even death seems to treat her more gently than it treats ordinary people. The burial procession forms at John's house. Believers from across the city join the quiet, solemn march. They carry her body to a tomb that had been prepared in the Kidron Valley, not far from the place where Jesus himself was buried and rose again. The location feels right for someone so close to him in life and in faith. As they lay her body in the tomb, something unusual fills the air around them. Some hear what sounds like music coming from angels, harmonies that no earthly instrument could produce. Others notice a fragrance like paradise itself, more beautiful than any flower that grows in this world. Heaven seems to lean close during these sacred moments. The tomb is sealed according to custom. The mourners make their way back to their homes, carrying with them memories of an extraordinary woman and an extraordinary life. But within just a few days, persistent reports begin circulating through the Christian community. Something unprecedented has apparently occurred. Several believers report going to visit the tomb only to discover it empty. The burial cloths are still there, folded neatly, in the same way they were found in Jesus' tomb on the third day after his crucifixion. But Mary's body has disappeared without any trace or any explanation. Some suggest grave robbers, but nothing of monetary value was buried with her. Others propose that enemies of the church took the body to prevent it from becoming a site of veneration. But no group comes forward to claim responsibility, and the peaceful condition of the empty tomb argues strongly against any kind of violent removal. Other explanations begin emerging among the faithful. Perhaps God has raised Mary as he raised her son. Perhaps she was taken up into heaven while still clothed in her physical body. Perhaps death simply could not hold one so pure and so wholly given over to God. The apostles investigate these claims with care. They question witnesses, examine the empty tomb themselves, and pray for divine guidance in understanding what it means. While they cannot prove what happened, neither can they account for the mystery through any natural explanation. John, who cared for Mary until her final breath, speaks with quiet conviction about what he believes took place. God received her to himself, body and soul, as a reward for her perfect obedience and faith. Death became translation. Burial became assumption. Not everyone accepts this explanation right away. Some prefer to wait and see if clearer evidence emerges. Others argue that bodily resurrection should be unique to Jesus alone, and yet the empty tomb stands as silent testimony to something that ordinary death does not explain. The years go by without the mystery finding any resolution. The tomb remains empty. No body is ever recovered. No natural explanation satisfies all the evidence that exists. The assumption of Mary becomes accepted conviction among many Christians, though discussion continues in various communities across the world. Those who knew her best speak with growing certainty about what her destiny must have been. Her unique role as mother of the Messiah, they argue, deserved unique treatment in death. God honored her faithfulness with translation rather than corruption. Pilgrims begin coming to the empty tomb. They arrive seeking blessing, healing, and intercession on their behalf. Stories begin emerging of miracles associated with the site. Whether these accounts reflect historical reality or the deep longing of grief remains difficult to determine. Yet the visits continue. The mystery deepens rather than resolving itself as the years accumulate. What began as a puzzling disappearance develops into treasured doctrine for many believers. Mary's assumption becomes a symbol of hope for all who follow her son. Death does not have to have the final word. Different communities develop their own varying traditions about her final moments. Some emphasize peaceful death, followed by bodily resurrection. Others favor the idea of translation without any death at all. All of them agree that something extraordinary set her departure from this earth, apart from any ordinary passing. Artists begin capturing the assumption in various forms. Paintings show Mary being carried upward toward heaven, surrounded by angels. Sculptures catch the serenity of her expression as she ascends. These visual representations shape the way countless believers picture the mystery in their minds. The empty tomb itself becomes a place of pilgrimage and prayer. Believers gather there on the anniversary of her departure. They sing hymns, share memories, and bring their petitions seeking her intercession. The site transforms from a place of burial into a place of encounter. Whether the assumption represents something that literally and historically occurred, or whether it expresses a symbolic and theological truth, it gives voice to the deep Christian conviction about what Mary means. The woman who said yes to God's impossible plan receives an impossible reward. Faith recognizes the fittingness of this outcome. The mystery remains without a final answer in any conclusive sense. Each generation of believers must work out for themselves what to make of the empty tomb, the missing body, and the traditions that have accumulated around them. The evidence available supports various interpretations without proving any of them beyond all doubt. And yet the mystery itself serves an important purpose. It keeps Mary's story open rather than closed, allowing each person who comes to it to encounter her as someone fresh and present. She becomes not merely a figure from history, but a living presence. Not only an ancient mother, but a contemporary voice of intercession, the rise of Marian devotion. Decades pass since Mary's mysterious departure from the earth. The Church expands throughout the Roman Empire and into lands beyond its borders. With geographic growth comes theological development. Mary's role in the story of salvation receives increasing attention and honor from those who reflect on it. Early Christian writers begin exploring her significance with greater depth and care. They compare her to Eve, observing how her obedience undid the damage done by the first woman's disobedience. Where Eve brought death through sin, Mary brought life through faith. The parallel captures the Christian imagination and does not let it go. Her perpetual virginity becomes a subject of scholarly discussion. Some argue that she remained a virgin throughout her entire life, with Jesus as her only child. Others point to the gospel references that mention his brothers and sisters. The discussion shapes the doctrine that develops around her nature and calling. Artistic representations multiply as Christianity gains legal recognition and begins to move freely into public life. Paintings in Roman catacombs show Mary holding the infant Jesus. Mosaics in early church buildings depict her as the Queen of Heaven. These images reflect a growing reverence for her person and for the role she played. The title Mother of God begins gaining prominence in theological circles. If Jesus is truly divine, the argument runs, then Mary, who bore him in her body, deserves this exalted designation. The logic seems airtight, even if the phrase strikes some ears as startling at first. Council meetings take up questions about Mary's status. Bishops gather to define what Orthodox teaching should say about her relationship to Christ and to the community of believers. Their decisions become binding doctrine for the churches that accept the authority of such councils. Popular devotion frequently moves faster than official theology can keep up with. Ordinary believers develop prayers, hymns, and practices that give honor to Mary. They seek her intercession for the needs of their daily lives. They attribute miraculous help to her. The faith of ordinary people embraces her warmly and completely. Pilgrimage sites associated with Mary appear throughout the Christian world. Places that claim some connection to her life, Nazareth, Bethlehem, Jerusalem, draw visitors who come seeking blessing. Each location develops its own traditions and its own collected stories of miracles. Feast days celebrating Mary enter the liturgical calendar. Her nativity, her presentation, the Annunciation, and her Assumption all receive special commemoration throughout the year. These celebrations mark the Church's year, with recurring reminders of how central she is to the story of salvation. Monasteries dedicated to Mary establish themselves across Europe and Asia. Religious communities take her as their special patron. They develop devotional practices centered on the virtues she embodied: humility, obedience, purity, and compassion for those who suffer. The Ave Maria prayer takes shape, drawing from scriptural sources. Gabriel's greeting, combined with Elizabeth's blessing, produces the familiar words, "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with you. Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb." Theological reflection on Mary's sinlessness develops gradually across the centuries. Some propose that she was preserved from original sin from the very beginning, so that she would be a worthy vessel for the Incarnation. This doctrine of the Immaculate Conception generates both strong support and real controversy depending on the community. Marian apparitions begin occurring in various locations. Believers report visions of Mary bringing messages intended for the Church or for the world. These mystical experiences, whether accepted or questioned by official church bodies, have a significant influence on popular devotion. The Rosary develops as a distinctive form of Marian prayer. Repeated Ave Marias, combined with meditation on gospel mysteries, create a devotional practice that is accessible to people whether they can read or not. The beads become one of the most recognized symbols of Catholic identity. Art reaches extraordinary heights in its depictions of Mary. Renaissance masters produce masterpieces that show her in many different roles. The tender mother, the grieving figure of the Pieta, the gloriously assumed Queen of Heaven. These works shape the way countless believers have pictured her ever since. Cathedral building reflects the depth of Marian devotion in stone and glass. Notre Dame cathedrals rise throughout Europe, each one a testimony in architecture to love for Our Lady. Gothic architecture reaches toward heaven as a built expression of Marian reverence. Different cultures adapt devotion to Mary to fit their own particular customs and needs. Mexican Catholics embrace Our Lady of Guadalupe as their own. Irish believers venerate particular expressions of the Mother. Each community finds in Mary what it most needs at any given time: comfort, protection, or simple understanding. The Protestant Reformation brings challenges to some Marian doctrines and practices. Reformers argue that excessive attention to Mary obscures the unique mediating role that belongs to Christ alone. Catholics respond by defending the tradition, while sometimes pulling back from excesses that had crept into popular practice. The development continues across the centuries. Each generation discovers fresh meaning in her ancient story. She grows from a simple Jewish girl into a cosmic figure, from a historical person into an eternal archetype of faith and of what it means to be a mother. Modern papal declarations affirm Mary's special standing within the faith. The Immaculate Conception becomes formal dogma in 1854. The Assumption receives its own solemn declaration in 1950. These pronouncements give official form to convictions that many believers had already held for centuries. And yet through all of this development, the essential core of what she represents remains unchanged. Mary shows what perfect human response to divine initiative looks like. Her yes to Gabriel's announcement echoes through all of history as the model for every believer who faces the call of God. The rise of Marian devotion reflects a deep human need for maternal comfort and for an advocate who will speak on our behalf. In Mary, believers find someone approachable, someone who understands their struggles from the inside. She bridges the space between divine transcendence and human need in a way that no one else quite does. The legacy of Mary, mother to billions. 20 centuries have passed since Mary spoke her world-changing yes to the announcement Gabriel brought to her. Her influence has spread far beyond the small village where she first heard those words that would alter everything. Today, billions of people call her blessed and seek her intercession. Christianity has carried Mary's story to every continent. Churches bearing her name mark the landscape from the Arctic tundra to tropical islands. Her image appears in the world's greatest art galleries and in the humblest of homes, in vast cathedrals and in simple chapels built with mud and straw. The Catholic Church counts more than 1 billion members worldwide. For the great majority of them, Mary holds a place of special honor as Mother of God and as their own spiritual mother. They pray to her daily, turn to her in their times of trouble, and thank her for blessings they believe came through her intercession. Eastern Orthodox Christians, while holding some different theological positions, share a deep and genuine reverence for Mary. They call her Theotokos, the God-bearer, and honor her with elaborate liturgies and beautiful icons painted with great care and devotion. Her feast days mark some of the most important moments in their spiritual year. Even Protestant communities, despite the Reformation's criticism of certain practices, acknowledge the unique role Mary plays in salvation history. They study her appearances in the biblical text, admire the faith and obedience she displayed, and hold her up as a model for Christian discipleship. Islam honors Mary as the greatest woman who ever lived. The Quran tells her story with profound reverence and respect. Muslims believe in the virgin birth and regard her as chosen above all other women in the history of the world. She builds bridges between faiths that often seem to have very little common ground. Art galleries around the world display masterpieces that drew their inspiration from Mary. From Byzantine mosaics to Renaissance paintings, from Gothic sculptures to installations by contemporary artists, she has provided endless inspiration across every period and style. She embodies beauty, purity, love, and hope in ways that artists across the centuries have never stopped wanting to capture. Literature draws heavily on themes connected to her. Poets write verses honoring her virtues. Novelists explore her inner life and the world she inhabited. Playwrights dramatize the pivotal moments of her story. Her influence on human creativity shows no sign of being exhausted. Music carries her mark across every genre that exists. Gregorian chants preserve her memory. Classical composers create masses and motets for her feast days. Folk songs in countless languages tell pieces of her story in the rhythms and melodies of their own people. Even contemporary musicians find in her example something worth exploring and expressing. Hospitals and schools around the world bear her name. Charitable organizations invoke her patronage. Social justice movements draw on the Magnificat as their anthem for the poor and the overlooked. Her deep concern for the lowly continues inspiring people to action. Pilgrimage sites associated with her draw millions of visitors every year. Lourdes and Fatima, Guadalupe and Medjugorje. These places see constant streams of believers arriving to seek healing, hope, and spiritual renewal. Her presence seems somehow tangible in such locations. Scientific research examines claims connected to Marian miracles. Medical professionals study reported healings. Psychologists investigate the impact that Marian devotion has on mental well-being. Even those who approach the subject with skepticism acknowledge the real and measurable positive effects of the faith and hope she inspires. Feminist theologians have reclaimed Mary as a figure of strength and independence. They draw attention to the courage she showed in accepting a divine mission that carried real and serious danger. They lift up her prophetic voice in the Magnificat. She becomes for them a symbol of female empowerment rather than of passive submission to forces beyond her control. Interfaith dialogue frequently centers on the shared respect that different traditions hold for Mary. Jews recognize her as a faithful daughter of their tradition. Christians see her as the living bridge between the Old Covenant and the New. Muslims honor her as the supreme example of surrender to God's will. Liberation theologians embrace Mary's stated preference for the poor. Her Magnificat speaks of God raising up the lowly and filling the hungry with good things while sending the wealthy away empty. She becomes patron saint of movements that seek justice for those the world overlooks. Popular culture continues drawing on Marian imagery in its own ways. Films tell her story to new generations who might not otherwise encounter it. Television programs explore her historical significance. Social media spreads her image and her message instantaneously across global networks that span every culture and language. The digital age has given rise to new expressions of Marian devotion. Online prayer groups gather in virtual spaces. Apps provide rosary prayers and guides to meditation. Websites share messages attributed to apparitions and accounts of reported miracles. Technology places itself in the service of an ancient faith. Scientific discoveries continue adding new dimensions to how people appreciate her story. Archaeologists explore first-century Palestine. Historians research the social conditions of the world she inhabited. Anthropologists study the honor and shame cultures that formed the context of her life. Medical advances illuminate aspects of her experience that earlier generations could not have understood. Understanding of pregnancy and childbirth adds new depth to the accounts of the Nativity. Insights from psychology help explain the emotional journey she traveled. Neuroscience raises new questions about the nature of religious experience itself. Discussions about climate change have brought Mary into conversations about care for creation. Environmental movements draw on Catholic social teaching that carries Marian themes within it. She becomes an advocate for the protection of the earth that God placed in human hands. Space exploration raises new questions about what Mary's significance might mean in a cosmic frame. If human beings one day make their home on other worlds, will they carry her image with them? Does her motherhood extend in some sense beyond the boundaries of this earth? Her story seems capable of adapting to whatever new frontiers humanity reaches. Genetic research prompts theological questions no previous generation needed to consider. What does modern science have to say about virgin birth? How do we understand miraculous conception in light of what we now know about DNA? The ancient dialogue between faith and reason continues. Mary's story offers comfort during times of global crisis. Through pandemics, wars, and natural disasters, believers in enormous numbers turn to her for protection and for peace. She represents stability when everything around is chaos, hope in the darkest of hours. The future holds more development in Marian devotion and theology than anyone can now predict. New generations will keep discovering fresh meaning in her ancient story. Different cultures will find their own ways of expressing their love for her. Her influence will adapt and endure, as it always has. And yet, beneath every change and development that comes, Mary's essential message stays constant and clear. She shows all of humanity how to say yes to God's impossible plans. She demonstrates that ordinary people can be taken up into extraordinary divine purposes. She proves that love is stronger than fear. From a simple village girl to the mother of billions, Mary's journey crosses centuries and continents, cultures and languages. Her legacy lives on in every person who faces the impossible with faith, who chooses obedience over safety, who trusts in God's goodness even when every circumstance appears to argue against it. The story that began with an angel's greeting has never stopped unfolding. Each new believer who encounters Mary discovers that her yes makes their own yes possible. Her acceptance of God's plan opens a door through which others can walk into their own acceptance of theirs. The mother of Jesus becomes mother to all who follow him. In the end, Mary's greatest legacy may be the example she sets of what perfect trust looks like. She believed God's promises when every reasonable voice said they were impossible. She held to hope when all the circumstances pointed toward despair. She remained faithful when faithfulness cost her more than most people are ever asked to give. Today, as in every era before this one, the world needs exactly this kind of faith. It needs people willing to say yes to God's most radical and surprising plans. It needs mothers and fathers who will trust divine goodness over their own human calculations. It needs the kind of love Mary showed, sacrificial, trusting, and genuinely transformative. Her story continues because her example has not lost any of its relevance. Every generation encounters its own impossible announcements from heaven. Every believer must choose between fear and faith. In Mary, each one finds a guide who traveled this same path ahead of them and showed that it leads somewhere worth going. The legacy of Mary reaches beyond every religious boundary to touch every human heart that yearns for meaning, hope, and love. She represents the finest human response to divine invitation. She shows what becomes possible when an ordinary person cooperates fully with an extraordinary grace. Her yes echoes forward through history, making room for all the other yes answers that follow it. Her faith strengthens the faith of those who come after. Her love multiplies itself in the hearts of everyone who takes her example seriously. The simple girl from Nazareth has indeed become mother to billions, and her influence continues to grow with every day that passes.